Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed 25 million people. In some European cities, 8 out of every 10 people died. It happened fast, and it didn't care who you were. But here's the thing. For everyone who survived, they had to figure out how to keep living in a world that would never be the same. So what was life actually like after the plague finally ended? If you use these to fall asleep, hit subscribe so you don't miss any. Comment where you're at and the time too. Kind of fun seeing all the different places. Someone from Iceland commented once and I had to Google what time zone that even is. Alright, the Black Death tonight. But wait, are you comfortable? No really. Check. Pillows, blankets, the whole deal. Where we're going, you'll want to be settled. You open your eyes to morning light filtering through a hole in the roof. For a moment you forget where you are, but then it hits you. You're alive, actually alive, which is kind of a miracle considering half the people you've ever known are dead. The year is 1353, and the Great Mortality, what later generations will call the Black Death, has finally loosened its grip on Europe. 6 years of hell, and somehow you made it through. You blink, adjusting to the light, trying to process what survival even means in this new, half-empty world. Your stomach growls. Funny how that works. Plague or no plague, hunger still comes calling every morning. You roll over on your straw mattress, wincing at the familiar ache in your back. The world might have changed forever, but your body's complaints remain stubbornly the same. Breakfast will be interesting, you mutter to no one. Because here's the thing about surviving an apocalypse. The practical problems hit you first. And right now, the practical problem is that a simple loaf of bread might cost you a week's wages, if you can find it at all. One Florentine chronicler wrote that the food suitable for the sick, cakes and sugar, reached outrageous prices. Chicken and other poultry were unbelievably expensive, and that's if you could find them at all. Most farmers had either died or abandoned their fields. The crops withered while plague raged. Craftsmen locked up their workshops. The living were too busy burying the dead to worry about growing food. Imagine going to your local grocery store and finding 3 apples priced at $100. That's basically what was happening. A world where buying a chicken could financially ruin you, where sugar became so precious it might as well have been gold. You finally drag yourself from bed. Your feet hit the cold dirt floor and you shuffle to the window, looking out at a town you barely recognize. Half the houses stand empty, windows staring like hollow eye sockets. Some have collapsed entirely with no one left to maintain them. But it's not all apocalyptic. There's something else in the air, something you couldn't have imagined during those dark plague years. Opportunity. Because the world that's emerging is fundamentally different from the one that existed before. The balance of power has shifted, and if you're smart and lucky, you might just find yourself in a better position than you could have ever dreamed possible before the plague. Morning, calls a voice from outside. Your neighbour, Elena, is actually smiling as she walks past. She's wearing a new dress, nothing fancy, but definitely better than the rags she wore before the plague. They're hiring at the miller's, she says, offering triple the old wage. And that's when it hits you. The rules have changed. With so many dead, workers are suddenly valuable. For the first time in, well, forever, common people have leverage. The world before the Black Death was one of crushing overpopulation. Europe had hit its limit. Every piece of land was being farmed, every resource stretched thin. The population had been growing for centuries, leading to smaller farms, lower wages, and widespread poverty. Lords held all the power because peasants were easily replaceable. But now the fields sit empty, workshops are abandoned, and suddenly your labour, your simple ability to bake bread or smith metal or harvest crops, is the most valuable commodity in Europe. You grab a crust of yesterday's bread, paying an outrageous sum for it yesterday, and head out into the street. The smell hits you immediately. Not plague this time, thank God, but the lingering scent of emptiness, of houses closed up for months, of untended livestock, of crops rotting in fields with no one to harvest them. "Did you hear about Johann?" asks Elena as you fall in step beside her. "Got hired by the Count himself, triple wages and a place to stay?" Before the plague, Johann was nobody, just another farmhand struggling to feed his family. Now he's practically nobility, and Anna's taken over her husband's shop. Elena continues, eyes bright with an excitement that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "A woman running a metal-working shop. The guild tried to stop her, but there's no one else who knows the craft." You nod, trying to process this new reality. Women owning businesses, peasants negotiating wages. It's like the world has been turned upside down, and in many ways it has. The death toll wasn't just a human tragedy, it was an economic revolution. All those empty houses, they're now available for the survivors. All those abandoned workshops, ready for someone new to claim them. All those fields, just waiting for a clever peasant to take control. As you walk through town, you see signs of this transformation everywhere. A former servant now wearing clothes that would have marked him as a merchant before the plague. A young woman moving into a stone house that would have been far beyond her means just a year ago. A group of labourers arguing loudly with a noble about payment terms, and the noble actually negotiating rather than simply having them flogged. But don't mistake this for some kind of utopia. The world after the Black Death was chaotic, unstable, and in many ways deeply traumatized. Take Petrarch, for example. This Italian poet, who survived while 35 of his fellow monks died, wrote to his brother, "I would, my brother, that I had never been born or at least had died before these times." Picture yourself sitting there in a monastery, watching every single person around you die horrible deaths, covered in boils, coughing blood, delirious with fever, and you're just fine, completely fine, while they all die. 35 people gone, and you're still standing. How do you even process that? The guilt could crush you. Petrarch doubted that people in the future, that's us by the way, would even be able to understand what they went through. He wrote, "In what annals has it ever been read that houses were left vacant, cities deserted, the country neglected, the fields too small for the dead, and a fearful and universal solitude over the whole earth?" So yeah, dramatic, but the man had literally seen hell on earth, so we'll cut him some slack. The psychological trauma of the Black Death can't be overstated. Everyone, and I mean everyone, had lost multiple family members. Children were orphaned in massive numbers. Entire families disappeared. Whole villages were wiped out. Just close your eyes for a second and imagine that 2 out of every 3 people you know have just died horrible, painful deaths. Your family, your friends, your neighbours, most of them gone in the span of a few months. How do you rebuild a life after that? For many, the answer was deeply religious. The plague was obviously a punishment from God, right? So the survivors had to be better Christians, more devout, more pious. For others, the answer went in the completely opposite direction. If God would allow such horror, why worship him at all? Why not eat, drink, and be merry? After all, death could come again at any moment. These competing impulses, extreme piety and extreme hedonism, would shape European society for decades to come. But back to our story. You and Elena reach the town square, where a small market has sprung up. Before the plague, this square would have been packed with hundreds of vendors and shoppers. Now there are maybe 20 stalls, but the goods they're selling, much better quality than what you would have seen before. "Look at that," Elena whispers, pointing to a man selling fine cloth. "Silk, and look who's buying it." A woman you recognize as a baker's widow is running her hands over the expensive fabric. Before the plague, such luxury would have been unthinkable for someone of her status, but now she counts out coins from a heavy purse and smiles as the merchant cuts her several yards. This was happening all over Europe. Suddenly, regular people had money to spend. They'd inherited property and goods from dead relatives, they were earning higher wages due to the labour shortage, and many found themselves able to afford small luxuries for the first time ever. According to one chronicler in Florence, once the plague had finished, anybody who could get a hold of whatsoever kind of cloth or found the raw materials to make it became rich. Think about that. Just being able to find cloth could make you wealthy. That's how dramatically the economic landscape had shifted. Similarly, the chronicler continued, survivors inherited goods and wealth from their deceased family members. A person who previously had nothing could suddenly find themselves quite rich. It's like a lottery where the price of entry was watching everyone you love die. Not a great deal, but people took what they could get. Both men and women began to show off with clothes and horses, the same chronicler noted, clearly a bit judgmental about the whole thing. You can almost hear the medieval version of back in my day complaints. These survivors with their fancy clothes and horses. No respect. In my day, peasants knew their place, but that was precisely the point. Peasants no longer knew their place because the old social order was crumbling before their eyes. You stop at a bread stall, wincing at the prices, but handing over your coins anyway. The bread seller, a man who used to be painfully thin before the plague, now has a plump face and a fine wool tunic. Hear about the new laws? He asks as he wraps your purchase. What laws? You ask. Lords trying to freeze our wages, he snorts. Say we can't charge more than before the plague, as if that's going to work. And there it is, the first signs of backlash, because the nobility and the ruling classes weren't simply going to sit back and watch their power erode. They would fight to maintain the old order, setting the stage for conflicts that would reshape Europe for centuries to come. But that's a story for another time. Right now, your stomach is growling, and despite costing 10 times what it would have before the plague, the bread in your hands smells delicious. You tear off a piece as you continue walking, savouring the simple pleasure of food in a world where nothing else makes sense anymore. The morning sun climbs higher, illuminating a changed world. Empty houses and abandoned fields speak of the devastation that has passed, but the baker in his fine new clothes, the widow buying silk, and the labourers demanding higher wages, they speak of the strange, unpredictable future that is just beginning to unfold. As you pass the church, you notice that the doors stand open. Inside, a handful of people kneel in prayer, some giving thanks for their survival, others still mourning their losses. The priest is new, hastily trained to replace the old one who died ministering to the sick. His Latin is atrocious, and sometimes he stumbles over the prayers. But he's alive, and that's what matters in this new world. He catches your eye and nods. God has spared you, he says simply. But for what purpose? That's the question every survivor is asking themselves. Why me? Why did I live when so many others died? What am I supposed to do with this second chance? It's a question with no easy answer, but as you look around at this transformed world, but hope that whatever comes next might, in its own strange way, be better than what came before. The next morning dawns clear and crisp. You've managed to sleep soundly for once, the nightmares of plague corpses piled in streets finally beginning to fade. Your stomach is actually full, a strange feeling after years of scarcity. You step outside your house, well, not technically your house. It belonged to a family of 7, all dead now. You moved in 3 months ago when it became clear nobody was coming back to claim it. The guilt of living in a dead family's home has faded, replaced by pragmatic appreciation for having a solid roof. "Morning," calls a voice. It's Matteo, the smith's son, carrying a sack of something over his shoulder. "Got work today?" That question, so simple, yet so loaded with new meaning. Before the plague, you didn't get work. You were born into your work, bound to it by tradition, family, and a social order that seemed as immovable as the mountains. Maybe, you answer, heading to the market to see what's on offer. And isn't that a crazy sentence to say out loud? To have choices about your labour, to be able to see what's on offer as if your sweat and skill were valuable commodities rather than obligations? "Don't bother with old Bertrand," Matteo says, lowering his voice. "He's still trying to pay pre-plague wages. Giovanni is offering triple for field hands, though." You nod, taking in this valuable intelligence. This is the new reality of post-plague Europe in 1354, a bustling information economy where knowledge about wages could make or break your fortunes. Matteo adjusts his sack and grins. "Can you believe this? My father would beat me for even thinking about working for someone besides our Lord. Now I'm comparing offers like I'm some kind of, I don't know, valuable person or something." He laughs, but there's wonder in his voice. The plague didn't just kill people. It killed assumptions. It murdered certainties that had stood for centuries. As Matteo walks away, you consider how profoundly the economic landscape has shifted in just 1 year since the worst of the plague passed. It's not just that wages have risen, it's that the entire relationship between worker and employer has been fundamentally rewritten. In Florence, wages jumped from 12 to 28% from the 1340s to the 1350s. By the 1360s, they'd rise 40% higher than pre-plague levels. But those are just numbers. The reality was far more visceral. Take this example. At a place called Farnham All Saints in England, lords were suddenly paying 67% more per acre for reaping than before the plague. Plus, reapers were now getting bigger tips and food perks on top of that. Or how about the ploughman at Cuxham who was making 2 shillings weekly before the plague? In 1349, as the plague raged, he demanded 3 shillings. By 1350, he was asking for 10 shillings, a 5-fold increase. You find yourself smiling at this thought as you walk toward the town centre, the sweet, sweet consequences of supply and demand. With half the workforce dead, the survivors could basically name their price. Hey, watch it. You nearly bump into a well-dressed man who's standing in the middle of the road, looking furious as he directs workers who are loading a cart. "You think this is acceptable?" he's shouting at them. 6 denarii for a day's work? My father paid 2. The workers don't flinch. One of them, a grey-haired man built like an oak tree, just shrugs. "Your father paid 2 denarii when there were 10 men begging for work," he says simply. "Now there's 3 of us left who know how to properly load these barrels. 6 denarii, or find someone else." The merchant's face turns purple. But what can he do? Find someone else? There is no one else. "Fine," he spits. "But I'll remember this when times change." But you and everyone else who survived the plague know a secret. Times aren't changing back. Not to the way they were before. The population collapse was too severe, the economic reset too profound. You continue past this little drama toward the market square, where another economic phenomenon is playing out. Before the plague, peasants mostly grew grain, backbreaking labour-intensive work that required many hands. Now, with fewer workers available, many landowners were switching to sheep. Sheep farming was genius in a post-plague economy. It required minimal labor, just a shepherd and maybe a dog, but produced valuable wool that could be sold for hefty profits. As a result, vast tracts of former cropland were being converted to pasture. The market square reflects this shift. Where once there would have been mostly grain and vegetables for sale, now there are merchants selling wool, cloth and leather goods. Quality goods too, not the rough homespun of pre-plague days, but finer fabrics that would have been reserved for the upper classes before. You there. A voice cuts through the market noise. You turn to see a well-dressed woman beckoning from a stall. She's selling finished clothing, tunics, dresses and cloaks that make your current outfit look like something a dog would refuse to sleep on. Need work? She asks directly. Doing what? Can you sew? You hesitate. You can sew a bit. Enough to mend your own clothing at least. A little, you admit. Good enough, she says briskly. I'll teach you the rest. 3 shillings a week plus room and board. Your jaw drops slightly. 3 shillings a week? That's more than most peasants would see in a month before the plague, and room and board on top of it? Why me? You can't help asking. The woman sighs, gesturing around the market. Look around. Half my competitors are dead. The ones who survived can't find enough skilled workers. I've got orders from as far away as Flanders and not enough hands to fulfill them. So, are you interested, or should I ask someone else? And there it is again, that shift in power. She needs you more than you need her. It's a dizzying reality for someone who grew up in a world where common folk were as disposable as autumn leaves. I'm interested, you say, trying not to sound too eager. Good. Start tomorrow at dawn. She hands you a small coin as a deposit. That's to seal our agreement. Don't be late. As you pocket the coin and walk away, your mind reels at the opportunity that's just fallen into your lap. 3 shillings a week, room and board, all for work that won't break your back or leave you at the mercy of weather and crop failures. This scene was playing out across Europe as survivors found themselves with unprecedented economic leverage and opportunities. Skilled artisans could practically name their price. Even unskilled labourers were commanding wages that would have been unimaginable before the plague. You stop at a bread seller's stall and notice something else that's changed. The bread is white, made from fine wheat flour, not the coarse, dark bread that was the staple of common folk before the plague. How much, you ask, expecting it to be far beyond your means. The seller names a price that's high but not outrageous. Given the coin now warming your pocket, you buy a small loaf and bite into it, savouring the soft texture. White bread, the food of nobility, now available to someone like you. Hey, not bad, right? Says a voice beside you. You turn to see a man in simple but well-made clothes, also enjoying a piece of bread. He grins at your evident enjoyment. Died by the thousands, but those of us left can eat like lords, he says with a mix of satisfaction and lingering grief. Name's Thomas. I'm a mason. A mason? I thought masons were part of a guild. Very exclusive. He laughs. Were is the key word there. Half the guild died. The other half couldn't keep up with demand. They started taking on anyone who could lift a stone. He pats his purse. And paying well for it too. What about you? You tell him about the sewing job you've just accepted. Smart. He nods. Indoor work, steady pay, skilled craft, better than breaking your back in the fields. He lowers his voice. Between you and me, the lords are getting desperate. They're trying to enforce the old wage laws, but nobody's listening. He's right about that. Across Europe, rulers were issuing proclamations trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. In England, the government enacted the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and then the more severe Statute of Labourers in 1351. The laws stated that workers' wages must remain at 1346 levels before the plague struck. They even made it illegal for a healthy, unemployed person to refuse work at those rates. You can guess how well that went over. My cousin was caught asking for higher wages, Thomas confides. They put him in the stocks for a day. Next week he was hired by a merchant from the next town over for twice what he'd been asking. That was the reality. Laws could be passed, but they couldn't be enforced. Not when the entire economic foundation of society had been upended by demographic collapse. The supply of labour had fallen by half, but the demand remained nearly the same. Land still needed to be farmed, goods still needed to be produced, services still needed to be provided, and with fewer people available to do all this work, each individual worker's value skyrocketed. As you finish your bread, you notice something else that's different about the marketplace. There are women running stalls that would have been exclusively male domains before the plague. There's a female blacksmith, a female butcher, even a female scribe taking notes for a merchant. A lot more women in trades now, Thomas remarks, following your gaze. My new master mason is a woman. Husband and sons all died. She was always the brains of the operation anyway, just couldn't show it before. Now, he shrugs, she's the best stonecutter in the region and she knows it. This too was part of the economic transformation. With so many men dead, women stepped into roles that had been denied them before. Necessity trumped tradition. Widows took over their husbands' businesses. Daughters inherited property and trades. The plague, in its terrible way, had created opportunities that would have been unthinkable in the rigid gender roles of pre-plague society. Mind you, Thomas continues, not everyone's happy about the new order. The nobles are furious that they have to pay decent wages now. The merchants hate that they can't gouge us like before. The church is split, half of them saying it's God's will we have better lives now. The other half saying we're being prideful and sinful for wanting more than our station allows. A bell tolls in the distance, marking the hour. Thomas finishes his bread and wipes his hands. Got to get to work, he says. Good luck with the sewing job. Oh, and watch out for the bailiff. He's been trying to enforce those wage laws. Nasty piece of work. As Thomas walks away, you consider your options. With a job lined up for tomorrow, you have the rest of the day free. You could explore the town further, or maybe visit the church to give thanks for your survival and new opportunity. You decide to wander the streets for a while, taking in the strange new reality of this post-plague world. The physical scars of the Black Death are still visible everywhere. Empty houses, untended gardens, workshops with tools laid out as if their owners just stepped away for a moment instead of being carried to mass graves. But there are signs of renewal too. New construction is happening. Houses are being repaired. Fields on the town's edge are being reclaimed from the encroaching wilderness. As you turn a corner, you come across a magnificent sight. A stonemason crew working on what appears to be a brand new church wing. The stone is fresh cut, the design elaborate. Thomas is there, carefully setting a carved block into place under the direction of a stern-faced woman who must be his master mason. It's a memorial, explains an old man who notices your interest. For those we lost, the wool merchants are paying for it. They've made fortunes since the plague, what with all the new sheep farming. The economics of memorials, even grief and remembrance are shaped by the new financial realities. Beautiful work, you comment. Aye. The old man nods, and paid for with beautiful money too. 10 years ago, these masons would have earned a pittance for twice the work. Now they command proper respect and wages. This was another aspect of the post-plague economy. With increased wages came increased respect for labour and craftsmanship. Work that had been taken for granted before was now valued, not just in monetary terms, but in social status as well. A group of well-dressed merchants passes by, deep in conversation. They glance at the memorial construction with a mixture of approval and calculation, no doubt weighing the spiritual benefits against the considerable expense. "Can't find enough dyers," you overhear one saying. "Offering 20% more than Amsterdam, and still they won't come." "Try 30. Another suggests. "We'll make it back tenfold on the finished cloth." They move on, their voices fading, but their conversation illustrates yet another facet of the new economy. Skilled trades like dyeing cloth had become so valuable that cities were competing for workers, driving wages even higher. As the afternoon wears on, you make your way back toward your adopted home. The streets are quieter now, with most people at work or finishing their daily business. The sun slants through half-empty rows of houses, casting long shadows. You pass a group of children playing with a ball, fewer children than would have been seen before the plague, but these look healthier, better fed. Their clothes are of better quality too. With higher wages, parents could afford to feed and clothe their children properly, even those of relatively modest means. This was one of the more positive outcomes of the economic shift. Improved nutrition and living conditions led to better health outcomes, particularly for the young. Life expectancy, which had been dismally low before the plague, began a slow but steady increase in the decades that followed. Near your house, you spot your neighbour Elena again. She's hanging laundry that's noticeably finer than what she would have worn before the plague. "Got the weaving job," she calls out cheerfully. "Starting next week, 6 shillings a month plus a share of the cloth we produce." "That's wonderful," you reply, sharing her genuine joy at this opportunity. "Never thought I'd see the day," she says, shaking her head in wonder. "My mother worked herself to death for less than half that. And they're providing the loom, a real Flemish one, not those old things we used to use." This was yet another dimension of the post-plague economy. Investment in better tools and technology. With labour so expensive, it made economic sense to invest in equipment that could enhance productivity. This would eventually lead to significant technological advances across many industries. As the sun begins to set, you enter your house, beginning finally to think of it as truly yours rather than a borrowed space, and prepare a simple but satisfying meal. The white bread you purchased earlier is the centerpiece, accompanied by a small piece of cheese that would have been an unthinkable luxury in your previous life. Sitting by the window in the fading light, you reflect on all you've seen and heard today. The world is still recovering from the most devastating catastrophe in living memory. The dead are still mourned. Empty spaces still ache with absence. But from this tragedy has emerged a strange new reality, one where your labour has value, where your skills are sought after, where opportunities exist that would never have been possible in the overcrowded, rigidly stratified world that existed before the plague. Tomorrow, you'll begin your new job as an apprentice seamster, earning more in a week than your parents might have seen in a month. You'll eat white bread and work indoors, spared the back-breaking labour that wore previous generations down to the bone. It's a peculiar blessing, born of an unspeakable tragedy. As darkness falls, you wonder what this new world will become as it continues to reinvent itself in the shadow of so much death. The answer, though you can't know it yet, will reshape Europe in ways no one could have imagined when the first plague ships arrived on distant shores just a few years ago. As you drift towards sleep, one thought surfaces clearly: the old world died with its victims. And, for better or worse, you are helping to build whatever comes next. Dawn comes with a thin grey light filtering through the small window. Your first day as an apprentice seamster begins today, and you're awake before the cockerels even start their morning chorus. New clothes, that's your first thought. Not the rough homespun you've worn all your life, but something that befits your new position. With 3 shillings a week promised, you can actually afford to think about such luxuries. It's a strange thought. Before the plague, your clothing was whatever you could make or inherit or patch together. The idea of choosing what to wear, of using clothes as a statement of status rather than mere necessity, that was for nobles and wealthy merchants. Not for common folk like you. But the world has changed. You head to your new workplace, stomach fluttering with anticipation. The cloth merchant's shop sits on the better side of town, a 2-story timber building with actual glass in the windows, small, thick panes that distort everything behind them into watery shapes. "You're early," says the merchant woman. "Mistress Agnes, you've learned her name is," as she opens the door. "Good. I can't abide laziness." She leads you inside to a workshop space where 3 other people are already setting up for the day. 2 women and a man, all bent over various projects, their fingers moving with practiced precision. "This is the new one," Agnes announces. "Show him what to do, Marjorie." A woman with streaks of grey in her dark hair nods and beckons you over. Her fingers don't stop working as she looks you up and down. "Ever sewn anything finer than sackcloth?" she asks, not unkindly, but directly. "Not really," you admit. She nods, unsurprised. "Before the plague, I wouldn't have been allowed to even speak to someone like you," she says, matter-of-factly. "I was a lady's maid in a great house, learned fine stitching by watching. Now look at me, running a sewing room training common folk." There's no bitterness in her voice, just a statement of how profoundly the world has shifted. "Half the nobility I served are dead," she continues, hands still working the cloth. "The other half can't find skilled help at any price. So here we are, you learning a craft that would have been forbidden to you before, me teaching someone who would have been beneath my station." She hands you a scrap of fabric and a needle. "We start with a basic stitch. Watch." As morning stretches into afternoon, you struggle with unfamiliar techniques, pricking your fingers repeatedly until they're spotted with tiny blood dots. But Marjorie is patient, and by midday you're producing stitches that, while not perfect, are at least serviceable. "Not bad," she says, during the brief break for a meal. "You've got good eyes and steady hands. You'll learn." The small crew eats together in the back room. Fresh bread, cheese, even a bit of cold meat. It's better food than you've ever had as a daily meal, and you try not to show your amazement. "Gets better," says the man. Walter, a former soldier who lost a few fingers to the plague but can still work a needle with his remaining digits. "Wait till you taste what they feed us at the festival days. Agnes knows how to keep her workers happy." "Has to," says the youngest of the seamstresses, a girl named Emma, who can't be more than 16. 3 shops in the guild lost all their workers to the Bristol workshop last month, offering silver cups as signing bonuses they are. "Silver cups?" you ask, certain you've misheard. "For skilled cloth workers," Walter nods. "World's gone mad in the best possible way, at least for those of us who survived." After the meal, Agnes herself comes to inspect your work. Her shrewd eyes miss nothing, but she seems satisfied with your progress. "You'll do," she declares. "Now, let's discuss your living arrangements. I've got a room above the shop. Small, but clean. You'll share with Walter there." A room. A real room. Not a corner of a drafty hovel shared with animals and 6 family members. Another luxury that would have been unthinkable before. "Thank you, mistress," you say, genuinely grateful. She waves away your thanks with a practical air. "I need my workers close and well rested. Can't have you trudging across town in all weather. Bad for productivity." But beneath her businesslike manner, you sense something else. A recognition that treating workers well is now a necessity, not a charity. She needs you as much as you need this job. The day passes in a blur of new skills and sore fingers. By the time dusk falls, you're exhausted but exhilarated. You've earned your first day's wages in a skilled trade, been fed better than ever before, and have a clean place to sleep. As you settle into your new room that night, Walter lights a small oil lamp, another luxury, and sits on his narrow bed opposite yours. "Strange times," he says, unwrapping a cloth from around his damaged hand to check the healing. 5 years ago, I was a nobody foot soldier getting paid scraps to potentially die for some lord's squabble. Now I'm a respected craftsman, earning more in a month than I used to see in a year. The plague changed everything, you observe. More than most realise, Walter agrees. It's not just about the money, though God knows that helps. It's about, he struggles for the right words, dignity, I suppose, being treated like a person with value, not just another replaceable body. This was the profound shift happening across Europe. The plague hadn't just raised wages, it had fundamentally altered how working people viewed themselves and how they were viewed by others. For centuries, peasants and labourers had been seen as little more than human cattle, necessary but fundamentally interchangeable parts of the economic machine. Now, suddenly, their skills and labour were precious commodities, and with that economic value came something that couldn't be measured in coins: respect. Lords hate it, Walter continues, lowering his voice even though it's just the two of you. All across England they're trying to roll back the clock, passing laws saying we can't ask for higher wages, can't leave our homes to seek better work, as if we'd go back to living like animals after tasting a better life. Indeed, the ruling classes were fighting desperately to maintain the old social order. In England, the authorities made it illegal for a healthy, unemployed person to refuse work. The punishment for workers who demanded higher wages, they could be put in the stocks or even branded on the face with an F for fugitive. Someone in the next town over got branded last month, Walter tells you. Know what happened next? A merchant from London came and hired him anyway, paid him double and flaunted it, said the brand was a mark of quality, showed the man had enough spine to stand up for himself. You both laugh at this, but there's a serious undertone. The struggle between workers demanding better treatment and authorities trying to force them back into subservience was no joke. It was a fundamental conflict that would shape European society for generations to come. You know what really gets under their skin, Walter says, warming to his subject. It's not just us asking for more money, it's us acting like we matter, like we deserve decent food and clean clothes and safe places to live, like we're people, not just tools to work their land. This too was a revolutionary concept. For centuries, the great mass of European peasantry had been conditioned to accept their lot as divinely ordained. The social hierarchy was presented as God's will. Nobles ruled because God had chosen them to rule, and peasants toiled because that was their appointed place in the great chain of being. The plague shattered that comforting fiction. If God had ordained the social order, why had he allowed so many nobles and clergy to die alongside common folk? Why had he permitted the collapse of the very institutions that supposedly carried out his will on earth? My old lord used to quote the Bible at us when we complained about our conditions, Walter recalls. The poor you will always have with you. That was his favourite. Made it sound like our poverty was holy, somehow. God's plan. He snorts derisively. Funny how God's plan always seemed to benefit him and cost us, but when half the village dropped dead from plague, his fields still needed tending. Suddenly, God's plan included paying us properly. The next morning, you wake to the sound of church bells and realise you've slept better than you have in years. The small room is modest by noble standards, but to you it feels like a palace. Clean straw mattress, wool blanket, actual privacy. At breakfast, another meal that would have been a feast day indulgence in your previous life, Agnes announces that you'll be accompanying her to the cloth market. Need to see where our materials come from, she explains. Can't make quality garments if you don't understand quality cloth. The market is bustling despite the depleted population. Merchants from as far away as Flanders and Italy have brought their wares: silks, fine wools, linens, even cotton from distant eastern lands. Before the plague, you would have been lucky to glimpse such luxury goods from afar. Now you're running your fingers across them, learning their textures and qualities under Agnes's critical tutelage. Feel that? She says, placing your hand on a particularly fine wool. That's from sheep raised in the northern hills. Better grazing land means better wool. Remember that. As you move through the market, you notice something odd. There are peasants, actual field workers in rough clothes, examining and even purchasing small amounts of finer fabrics than they would have dreamed of owning before. Agnes follows your gaze and nods. Another change since the plague. Peasants with money to spend. The smart lords have figured out that letting their workers buy a few luxuries keeps them happier and more productive. The stupid ones are still trying to squeeze blood from stones. One such stupid lord is creating a scene several stalls away. A tall, thin man in expensive but somewhat dated clothing is berating a group of field workers. "You are bound to my land," he shouts, face flushed with anger. "Your fathers and their fathers before them served my family loyally. This talk of higher wages and fewer service days is treasonous." The peasants, 6 men and women with the weathered faces and strong hands of those who work the earth, stand their ground with a confidence that would have been unthinkable before the plague. "With respect, my lord," says one older man, clearly the spokesman, "there are 3 farms in the next valley offering better terms. We're simply asking for fair treatment." "Fair?" the lord sputters. "What do peasants know of fairness? Your place is to work the land, not to make demands." "Our place," says the old peasant with quiet dignity, "is wherever we can support our families best." The crowd that has gathered murmurs approvingly. The nobleman looks around, seemingly expecting support from fellow elites, or at least the town authorities, but finds none. Even the wealthy merchants are watching, with barely concealed amusement. "This isn't over," the lord finally says, backing down in the face of public opinion. "The king will hear of this insolence." As he stalks away, the crowd actually cheers the peasants. Agnes shakes her head, smiling slightly. "Poor fool," she says, "still living in the old world. Doesn't he realise that even the king can't turn back time? There aren't enough soldiers in England to force people back to the old ways, not when there are better options available." This confrontation encapsulates the profound shift in class relations occurring across Europe. Before the plague, peasants were effectively tied to the land through various legal and economic mechanisms. Serfs, in particular, were bound to their lords and could not legally leave without permission. But with half the population gone and desperate competition for workers, these bonds were breaking down. Peasants were voting with their feet, abandoning harsh masters for those offering better conditions. And without enough administrators or soldiers to enforce the old restrictions, authorities could do little but fume impotently. Back at the shop, you spend the afternoon learning to cut patterns under Marjorie's watchful eye. As you work, Emma chatters about the changes in her own family's circumstances. "My father was a ploughman before the plague," she explains, carefully pinning fabric. "Worked from dawn to dusk every day of his life, still barely had enough to feed us. Now he's overseeing 3 fields for the abbey, gets paid in actual coin, and works only 6 days a week." 6 days, you ask. not 7. Oh, nope. Abbess insisted everyone gets Sundays truly free now, says it's proper Christian practice. Emma grins. Think it has more to do with keeping workers happy than religious devotion, but we'll take it. This too was part of the transformation, working conditions, improving alongside wages. With their labour now valuable, workers could demand not just better pay but better treatment, more rest days, safer conditions, even small perks like food provided during the workday. Best part is the food, Emma continues, echoing your thoughts. We actually eat meat now, not just on feast days, but regular days too. Father says his father went months without tasting meat except at Christmas. Now we have it weekly. The improved diet of ordinary people was one of the most significant long-term effects of the post-plague economy. With higher wages, peasants and urban workers could afford better nutrition, particularly more protein. This in turn led to better health and eventually increased life expectancy. As the weeks pass, you settle into your new life as an apprentice seamster. Your skills improve rapidly, and soon you're trusted with increasingly complex work. Your wages allow you to eat better than ever before, and you notice the effects. More energy, fewer minor illnesses, even your teeth hurt less than they used to. One Sunday afternoon, enjoying your free time in the town square, you encounter Eleanor, who's similarly flourishing in her new weaving position. Look at us, she laughs, spreading her arms to display a dress of finer quality than most peasants would have owned before the plague. Who would have thought 2 village nobodies would end up like this? Not the lords, that's for certain, you reply, sharing her amusement. Speaking of lords, Elena lowers her voice conspiratorially. Did you hear about Lord Raymond's estate? Half his peasants walked off last month, just packed up and left for better opportunities in the south. He tried to stop them, but there were too many to chase. This was happening across Europe, mass movements of people seeking better conditions, better pay, better lives. Some historians call it voting with their feet, when peasants were no longer bound by practical necessity to remain in one place. They simply left situations that were abusive or unfair. What will he do now, you ask, genuinely curious about how the nobility were adapting. Rumour has it he's offering unheard-of terms to attract new workers, Elena says. 5 silver pennies a week, only 3 days of service to the manor, and newly built housing with actual wooden floors, not just dirt. You both marvel at this. The same lord who, before the plague, would have considered his peasants little better than farm animals was now desperately trying to lure workers with luxury accommodations and generous wages. The conversation is interrupted by the arrival of a sombre procession. A group of well-dressed burghers, town officials and guild masters are walking slowly through the square, reading from a scroll at each corner. Hear ye, intones the lead official. By order of His Majesty and the town council, it is hereby decreed that no worker shall demand wages higher than those paid in the year of our Lord 1346, before the great mortality. Those who violate this ordinance shall face imprisonment or public shame in the stocks. There's a moment of silence as the crowd digests this pronouncement. Then, astonishingly, someone laughs. Others join in. Soon there's open mockery following the officials as they continue their procession. They've tried this before, says a stonemason standing near you. 3 times now. Doesn't work. They can't enforce it. Why not? Asks a newcomer, obviously recently arrived from the countryside. Simple arithmetic, the mason explains. There aren't enough bailiffs to arrest all of us, and even if they did, who would do the work? The lords themselves? He laughs at the absurdity of noblemen trying to plough fields or bake bread. This was the practical reality that undermined all attempts to legislate away the new economic order. Enforcement was impossible in a world where workers had options and leverage. As the procession disappears around a corner, the crowd returns to its normal Sunday activities, the wage proclamation already dismissed as irrelevant. "They just don't get it," Elena says, shaking her head. "The world has changed. We've changed." And indeed, something fundamental had shifted in the consciousness of common people across Europe. Having tasted better conditions and greater autonomy, they were unwilling to return to the restrictive, often abusive relationships that had defined pre-plague society. In England, which lost around half its population, peasants became increasingly vocal in their demands for higher wages and better treatment. Lords who ignored the tense situation found themselves facing organised resistance and labour shortages that threatened their very way of life. The mounting tensions would eventually explode. In 1381, nearly 3 decades after the plague had passed, the English government made the catastrophic mistake of levying new taxes on a population already bristling with resentment over attempts to control their wages and mobility. The result would be the Great Revolt, what history now calls the English Peasants' Revolt, a massive uprising that would shake the foundations of medieval society and signal that the post-plague world could never return to the old feudal order. But that confrontation still lies in the future as you and Elena part ways in the town square. For now, you're both simply beneficiaries of the strange new reality, a world where plague survivors find themselves, despite the trauma and loss they've endured, with opportunities and freedoms their parents could never have imagined. As you head back to your room above the seamster's shop, you pass the church where a priest is delivering an afternoon sermon to a sparse congregation. His words drift out to the street, "And the last shall be first, and the first shall be last, for God in his wisdom has humbled the mighty and raised up the lowly." You smile to yourself, thinking that perhaps in the most terrible and unexpected way the biblical promise had come true. Through the horror of the Black Death, the rigid hierarchies that had defined European life for centuries were being unmade, and a new world, one with at least the possibility of greater fairness and dignity for common folk, was struggling to be born. Months pass in your new life as a seamster. Summer gives way to autumn, and the first chill of winter creeps into the morning air. The work is steady, the pay reliable, and your skills have improved to the point where Agnes now trusts you with fine garments for wealthy customers. Life has settled into a new rhythm, but the shadow of the plague never completely disappears. It lurks in empty houses, still standing vacant, in the gaps in every family, in the wary look that crosses people's faces when someone coughs too harshly or develops an unexplained fever. This morning that shadow falls more heavily than usual. A rumour is spreading through town. Plague has been spotted in a port city 3 days' journey away. "Just talk," Walter assures you as you both work on a nobleman's cloak. People see one sick beggar and immediately think the Great Death has returned. But you notice he's working by an open window despite the autumn chill, and you notice Agnes has placed small bowls of aromatic herbs around the workshop, their sharp scent filling the air. Nobody wants to acknowledge their fear openly, but the signs are everywhere. When the town crier passes through the square later that day, announcing that the town council will meet to discuss preventive measures, the entire workshop falls silent, listening intently. "Thought it was just talk," you say to Walter, who shrugs uncomfortably. "Better safe than in a plague pit," he mutters. The fear is rational. Everyone in Europe now understands that plague is contagious, even if they don't understand exactly how it spreads. The hard-won knowledge of the first outbreak has been seared into collective memory. That evening, instead of returning directly to your room, you follow the crowd to the town hall where the council meeting has been opened to the public. The large hall is packed tight with anxious citizens, all speaking in low, tense voices. The town's senior physician, a stern man with a trimmed grey beard, stands to address the crowd. Unlike the physicians during the height of the plague, many of whom fled or died alongside their patients, this man projects confidence and authority. "My fellow citizens," he begins, "let us not give in to panic. Yes, there are reports of illness in Portsmouth, but we have learned much since the Great Mortality. We know how to protect ourselves better than our predecessors did." A voice calls out from the crowd. "How do we know it's not already here, hiding among us?" The physician nods, acknowledging the fear. "A fair question. We know the pestilence has certain signs. Buboes in the lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, armpit and groin. Fever. Sometimes black spots on the skin. We have instructed all barbers and midwives to report any such symptoms immediately." This systematic monitoring of symptoms was one of many practical measures developed in the plague's aftermath. Before the Black Death, medical response to outbreaks was haphazard at best. Now, cities and towns across Europe had established protocols for identifying and reporting potential cases. Furthermore, the physician continues, "We understand now that the pestilence can spread from the sick to the healthy and even through the clothing and belongings of the afflicted." This, too, was hard-earned knowledge. Italian writer Boccaccio had reported that the disease spread not only between people but through objects a plague victim had touched. This understanding led to new approaches for containing outbreaks. "Should the pestilence reach our town," the physician explains, "we will follow the Venetian method. Any home with infected persons will be sealed for 40 days with food and necessities provided from outside. No one will enter or leave until the 40 days have passed." A worried murmur passes through the crowd. The idea of being locked in a home with plague is terrifying, but most recognize that containing the disease is necessary for the greater good. Additionally, the physician adds, raising his voice above the murmurs, "all vessels and travellers arriving from suspect regions will be held outside the town walls for a period of quarantina, 40 days, to ensure they carry no infection." This concept of quarantine was perhaps the most significant medical innovation to emerge from Europe's plague experience. First formally implemented in Venice in 1374, the practice quickly spread to other cities as its effectiveness became apparent. The town's head merchant stands now, a practical concern on his mind. "And what of trade? We cannot simply halt all commerce for fear of what might happen." "Nor should we," the physician agrees. "But goods can be purified. Textiles and other absorbent materials should be aired in sunlight for several days. Hard goods can be washed with vinegar. These measures, while not perfect, offer significant protection." The meeting continues late into the night with various practical measures debated and discussed. As you listen, you're struck by how differently Europe was approaching disease now compared to just a decade ago. Before the Black Death, illness was often seen as purely divine punishment, with prayer and penance the only meaningful responses. Now, while spiritual explanations still held sway, they existed alongside practical, systematic approaches to prevention and containment. Walking home in the darkness, you find yourself accompanied by Marjorie, the senior seamstress from your workshop. "Frightening, isn't it?" she says, pulling her cloak tighter against the night chill. "No matter how much time passes, the fear never really leaves you, not if you live through it." "You were in London during the plague?" you ask, realizing you know little about her past. She nods, her face grim in the dim light of the street torches. "Lost my husband, my parents, and 2 children in the span of 3 weeks. Sometimes I still wake up thinking I can hear the death carts in the streets." You walk in silence for a moment, unsure what to say to such profound loss. The physicians had these beaked masks, she continues suddenly, stuffed with herbs and spices, looked like giant birds stalking through the sick rooms. Most fled when things got really bad, but a few stayed, brave souls. The image she describes has become increasingly common across Europe. Doctors had developed specialized protective clothing, including masks with long bird-like beaks filled with aromatic substances believed to purify the bad air before it could be breathed in. Do you think they help? The masks, the quarantines, all of it, you ask. Marjorie considers this thoughtfully. I think we need to believe they help, that we're not completely helpless. But truthfully, if the Great Death returns in full force, God help us all. Her fatalism is sobering, but not unusual. Even with new preventative measures, the plague remained the most terrifying prospect imaginable to medieval Europeans. The next morning, the town is buzzing with the council's decisions. Official plague protocols have been activated as a precaution. Travellers from affected regions will be quarantined outside the walls, regular street cleaning has been ordered, and watchmen have been instructed to look for signs of illness among beggars and travellers. At the workshop, Agnes has instituted her own protective measures. In addition to the aromatic herbs, she now insists that all workers wash their hands with vinegar when entering the shop and at midday. "Smells terrible," complains Emma, sniffing her vinegar-drenched fingers. "And it dries out the skin, something awful." "Better dry hands than black buboes," Agnes replies sharply. "My sister was a laundress during the Great Death, handled the clothes of the sick, was dead within days, her neck swollen like a toad's throat. No one complains about the vinegar after that." This focus on cleanliness was another change in post-plague Europe. While the connection between hygiene and disease wasn't fully understood in modern terms, practical observation had led many to associate filth with illness. Towns began to enforce street cleaning more rigorously, and personal cleanliness gained new importance. As you work, a commotion outside draws everyone to the window. A group of figures is moving slowly through the street, led by a man in official town livery. They stop at a house across the way, and the official nails something to the door, a wooden panel painted with a simple red cross. "Plague panel," Walter whispers, making the sign of the cross. "Someone's sick inside." Agnes immediately orders the shop windows closed, despite the stuffiness this will cause. The plague panel was another innovation developed during and after the Black Death. These simple markers identified houses with infection, warning healthy people to stay away. They would remain in use for centuries, evolving eventually into more sophisticated quarantine signage. "Will they bring out the dead?" Emma asks, her young face pale with fear. "Not yet," Agnes says grimly. "First they seal them in, 40 days of quarantina. If anyone survives, they can come out after that." The reality of plague containment was often brutal. Entire families, sick and healthy alike, would be locked together in their homes. Food and water would be delivered, but no one could enter or leave until the quarantine period ended. Many households saw every member perish, while in others, uninfected family members often contracted the disease while confined with their sick relatives. The sight of the plague panel across the street casts a pall over the workshop. Work continues, but conversation dwindles to necessary communication only. Everyone is listening for the telltale sounds of the sick, coughs, cries of pain, the distinct moaning delirium that accompanies plague fever. By evening, more panels have appeared throughout town. The rumour now is that a merchant returned from Portsmouth bringing the pestilence with him. Should we leave? You ask Walter as you both prepare for sleep in your shared room. Find another town further from the outbreak. Walter considers this, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Could, but where's safe? Plague travels faster than rumours sometimes. Might be heading straight into it elsewhere. He's right, of course. Flight had been a common response during the height of the Black Death, but it often proved futile or even counterproductive, as fleeing citizens unknowingly carried the disease with them to new locations. Besides, Walter adds, Agnes pays well, and the town's taking proper measures. Those plague panels went up fast, means they're watching closely, better than some places where they pretend it's not happening until half the town is dead. This too was a development since the first outbreak, the speed of response. European authorities had learned that early identification and containment offered the best chance of limiting an outbreak's spread. Sleep comes fitfully that night, troubled by anxious dreams. You wake several times, listening for sounds of distress from the quarantined house across the street, but hear nothing beyond the normal night noises of a medieval town. Morning brings a new development. Town criers announce that the council has arranged for physicians to examine anyone with suspicious symptoms free of charge. This represents another evolution in public health response. Proactive case-finding rather than simply reacting to obvious disease. At the workshop, Agnes makes an announcement of her own. I've spoken with the other guild masters, she says, her usually businesslike demeanour even more clipped than normal. We're implementing additional protections. No apprentice or journeyman is to enter any home marked with a plague panel. Deliveries will be left at the doorstep. Payment will be collected after being soaked in vinegar overnight. The specific attention to objects that might transmit disease reflects growing understanding of how plague spread. While the concept of bacteria was still centuries away, medieval Europeans had observed that plague could travel through objects, especially textiles and other absorbent materials. Additionally, Agnes continues, we will be fumigating the workshop daily. Fumigating? You ask, unfamiliar with the term. Agnes gestures to a metal brazier being set up in the corner. Burning specific herbs and woods creates smoke that drives away corrupt air. The Venetians swear by it. This practice of fumigation, burning substances to purify the air, became widespread in post-plague Europe. It was based on the miasma theory, which held that disease spread through foul or corrupted air. Europeans had embraced this theory wholeheartedly after the Black Death. If corrupt air caused illness, then sweet-smelling, purifying substances could prevent it. This belief led to a variety of protective practices. That afternoon, you see some of these practices in action when you're sent on an errand to deliver finished garments to a wealthy merchant's home. The merchant meets you at his gate rather than inviting you inside, a common precaution during potential outbreaks. What catches your attention, though, is the small silver pomander hanging from a chain at his waist. The perforated metal ball emits a strong, sweet scent that wafts towards you as he inspects the delivery. Imported spices, he explains, noticing your interest. Cloves, cinnamon and ambergris purifies the air I breathe. Such pomanders had become fashionable among those who could afford them in the decades following the first plague outbreak. Florentines in particular had taken to carrying bottles of perfume on their belts and dousing their hands in vinegar when interacting with others. The scientific validity of these measures varied widely. Vinegar did have some actual disinfectant properties, though medieval people didn't understand why. The aromatic fumigations and perfumes did little against bacteria, but might have offered some protection against fleas, the primary vector of bubonic plague. Regardless of their actual effectiveness, these practices represented something profound, a shift from pure fatalism to active prevention. Medieval Europeans were no longer simply accepting disease as inevitable divine punishment. They were fighting back with the tools and understanding available to them. As you return from the delivery, you pass by the town's main gate, where a makeshift camp has been established outside the walls. This is the quarantine area for travellers from affected regions, a concept that would have been foreign before the Black Death, but was now standard practice in many European cities. Guards ensure no one enters without permission, while physicians in their distinctive protective garb examine new arrivals for signs of illness. The beaked masks that Marjorie described are indeed unsettling, black-clad figures with glass-eyed bird faces moving among anxious travellers. These protective uniforms were another medical innovation that would evolve over centuries. Covering the physician from head to toe, they were designed to prevent bad air from reaching the wearer's body. While their effectiveness against bacteria was limited, they did provide some barrier against fleas and direct contact with infected patients. By the time you return to the workshop, rumours are flying about more cases in town. The atmosphere is tense, but work continues. There's a sense of determination that wasn't present during the first outbreak, a collective resolve to face the disease with knowledge rather than panic. That evening, the town council calls another meeting. The chief physician provides an update, his tone carefully measured to avoid causing undue alarm. "We have confirmed 6 cases within the walls," he announces. "All have been properly contained with plague panels and quarantine. The affected streets have been fumigated, and all who had contact with the sick before symptoms appeared are being monitored. There's murmuring in the crowd, but not the blind panic such an announcement would have caused during the first outbreak. People are frightened, certainly, but there's also a sense that the situation is being managed. Citizens are reminded to carry vinegar for hand washing, to avoid large gatherings where possible, and to report any suspicious symptoms immediately," the physician continues. "The council has also ordered additional street cleaning and the removal of waste that might harbour corrupt air." The meeting concludes with practical instructions rather than calls for prayer or penance. While the church still plays a significant role in the town's life, the response to potential plague is now firmly grounded in observable practical measures. As the days pass, the number of plague panels in town grows slowly but doesn't explode into the widespread devastation of the original outbreak. The quarantine measures appear to be working, containing the disease to isolated pockets rather than allowing it to sweep unchecked through the population. This relative success reinforces the value of the new approaches to disease. Towns and cities that implement quarantine, waste removal, and early case identification consistently show lower mortality than those relying solely on divine intervention. One morning, about 2 weeks into the small outbreak, you notice something as you pass the first house that received a plague panel. Workers in protective clothing, heavy gloves, covered faces, fully enclosed garments, are removing bodies. Unlike during the height of the Black Death, when corpses might lie unattended for days, these dead are being handled promptly and systematically. The workers carry them to a covered cart rather than exposing them to public view, and you overhear them mentioning that the bodies will be buried in lime outside the town walls, another preventative measure developed from hard experience. What strikes you most, though, is that they're also removing household goods, bedding, clothing, even wooden furniture. "Everything the sickness touched must be burned," explains an official overseeing the process. "Nothing can be salvaged or sold." This understanding that objects could harbour infection represented a significant advance in disease control. During the height of the first outbreak, possessions of the dead were often distributed or sold, unwittingly spreading the disease further. By the time winter properly sets in, the small outbreak has been largely contained. A total of 23 people died, a tragedy for their families and friends, certainly, but a mere fraction of the town's population. Compared to the apocalyptic mortality of the original Black Death, it's a remarkable improvement. The experience leaves behind a changed town. New public health ordinances are issued. Streets must be cleaned weekly. Butcher's waste must be properly disposed of outside the walls. Stagnant water is to be drained, and a permanent quarantine station will be maintained at the town gates. These measures reflect Europe's evolving approach to disease, an approach that combined traditional beliefs about miasma and divine influence with practical observations about contagion and cleanliness. Over a shared cup of mulled wine in the depths of winter, when the threat has fully passed, Walter reflects on this new reality. Strange to think, he says, warming his hands on the cup, that something so terrible as the Great Death could lead to something good. But look at us now. We actually try to prevent sickness rather than just accepting it as God's will. Does it bother you, you ask? Thinking that way, some would call it blasphemous. Walter considers this, then shrugs. I figure God gave us minds to use. Maybe understanding how sickness spreads is part of his plan too. This philosophical shift, making space for human agency alongside divine will, was perhaps the most profound change of all. It would help lay the groundwork for the increasingly empirical, observation-based approaches that would eventually lead to modern medicine. As you sip the warm, spiced wine, you realize that you've witnessed not just economic and social transformation in the plague's aftermath, but an intellectual one as well, a subtle but significant change in how people understand their relationship with the natural world and their ability to influence their own fate. The fear of plague will never entirely leave Europe. Outbreaks will continue for centuries, though none as devastating as the Black Death, but each episode will be met with increasingly sophisticated responses, building on the hard-won knowledge of previous generations. Quarantine, waste management, isolation of the sick, protection of healthcare workers, systematic monitoring. These concepts, born in the traumatic aftermath of humanity's worst pandemic, would eventually evolve into the foundations of modern public health. As the winter deepens outside your window, you find an unexpected comfort in this thought that even from the darkest moments of human suffering, something valuable and lasting might emerge. Not a consolation for so many millions of deaths, perhaps, but at least a memorial that gives them some small measure of meaning. Spring arrives with a rush of green, and the small plague outbreak that threatened your town over winter becomes a fading memory. Life has returned to its new normal, a normal that continues to favor workers and craftspeople in ways unimaginable before the great mortality. You've been promoted from apprentice to journeyman seamster, with another increase in wages that would have seemed miraculous just a few years ago. Your room above the shop now has a small wooden chest containing actual savings, copper, and even a few silver coins that jingle pleasantly when you open it. But as trees bud and fields green, something else stirs as well. The nobility and ruling powers who have watched their traditional authority erode with each passing season since the plague are mobilizing to reassert control. The first sign comes on market day. A royal official flanked by armed guards stands in the town square reading a proclamation. A crowd gathers, your curiosity drawing you among them. By order of His Majesty the King, the official intones, unrolling an impressive scroll bearing a wax seal, it is decreed that no labourer, craftsman or servant shall receive wages higher than those paid in the year of our Lord 1346, before the great mortality visited our realm. A murmur runs through the crowd. 1346 wages? That's less than half what most workers currently earn. The official continues, voice rising to be heard above the growing discontent. Furthermore, it shall be unlawful for any able-bodied man or woman to refuse work when offered at the decreed rates. Now there are open scoffs and muttered curses. The guards shift nervously, hands drifting to sword hilts. Those who violate this statute of labourers, the official concludes, shall face punishment including imprisonment, public humiliation in the stocks, and for repeat offenders, branding with a hot iron. The crowd erupts at this, angry shouts drowning out whatever else the official might have said. The guards close ranks around him, escorting him quickly away from the increasingly hostile gathering. "They can't be serious," says a baker standing next to you, flour still dusting his forearms. "Go back to starvation wages after we've tasted better." "Not likely. My cousin in the next county said they tried to enforce similar laws there," adds a mason. "Didn't work, nobody obeyed, and there weren't enough bailiffs to arrest everyone." This was the reality across Europe. Rulers were issuing proclamations and passing laws attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement proved nearly impossible in the face of widespread resistance and the basic economic reality of labour scarcity. Back at the workshop, the proclamation is the only topic of conversation. "Did you hear what they're trying to pull now?" Walter asks as soon as you enter, "telling us what we can earn like we're still bound serfs instead of free workers." Agnes, normally careful not to express political opinions that might affect her business, surprises everyone with a derisive snort. "Let them try," she says, checking the tension on a piece of expensive silk. "The fools don't understand the world has changed. They can write all the laws they want. Who's going to enforce them?" Her practical assessment echoes what you heard in the market. The authorities could issue proclamations, but without enough officials to enforce them, and with many of those officials themselves sympathetic to workers, the new laws were often just words on parchment. "Why are they doing this to I?" Emma asks, her young face puzzled. "Don't they understand we need to earn enough to live?" Walter gives a bitter laugh. "Oh, they understand. They just don't care. To them, we're tools, not people. Tools that suddenly got expensive and developed opinions." Agnes nods grimly. "Most lords are landowners first. They identify with other aristocrats who hate paying us fairly for our work. They'd rather return to the old days when they could squeeze us until we bled, then replace us when we dropped dead." This was indeed the motivation behind many of the wage control laws. The nobility and wealthy landowners saw themselves losing both economic power and social control as workers gained leverage. They were desperate to turn back the clock to a time when their authority was unquestioned. Later that week, you witness the first attempt at enforcement. Walking through town, you come upon a small crowd gathered around the public stocks. A man sits locked in them, looking simultaneously defiant and uncomfortable. "What did he do?" you ask someone in the crowd. "Miller's helper," comes the reply. "Asked for 6 pennies a day instead of the 2 they're claiming is legal now. Made an example of him." The man in the stocks meets your gaze directly, unashamed, despite his humiliating position. "Worth it," he calls out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Rather sit here a day than work for starvation wages the rest of my life." There's a murmur of approval from the crowd. Several people step forward to offer the man water or a bit of food, showing clear sympathy for his plight. The single guard watching over the prisoner looks uncomfortable, outnumbered, and facing a community that clearly sides with the criminal. This scene would be repeated across Europe in the months and years following the plague. Authorities would attempt to make examples of workers who demanded higher wages, only to find that public sentiment had shifted decisively in favour of labour. In some cases, the punishments grew more severe. You hear rumours from travellers about villages where workers caught demanding better pay were branded with an F, possibly for fugitive or falsifier. "That seems a little harsh for asking for a raise," you remark to Walter, as you both walk home one evening after hearing such stories. "That's the point," he replies darkly. "They want us terrified, easier to control people who are scared. But the scare tactics weren't working as intended. Instead of cowing workers into submission, they were breeding resentment and resistance, and they were highlighting the profound disconnect between rulers and the new economic reality." One morning, Agnes calls everyone together before work begins. Her expression is unusually serious. "The Cloth Merchants Guild met last night," she announces. "The King's officials are pressuring us to reduce wages to pre-plague levels. They're threatening fines and loss of guild privileges if we don't comply." A tense silence falls over the workshop. "These are your livelihoods being discussed. What did the guild decide?" Marjorie asks finally. Agnes's stern expression cracks into a small, defiant smile. "We're going to nod and agree to their faces. Then we're going to continue paying fair wages and recording them as bonuses and living allowances in our books." This creative resistance was common among guild masters and merchants caught between royal decrees and economic reality. On paper, they would appear to comply with wage controls while finding workarounds to continue paying the higher rates that market conditions demanded. "Won't they catch on?" Emma asks. "Eventually," Agnes concedes, "but by then, hopefully, they'll realise these proclamations are nothing but wasted parchment. You can't legislate away basic supply and demand." Her use of these economic concepts, though she wouldn't have used those exact terms, reflects how practical experience was teaching ordinary people principles that scholars would later formalize into economic theory. The plague had turned European society into an unintended laboratory for observing how markets respond to dramatic shifts in labor supply. Spring progresses into early summer, and rumours begin circulating about bigger troubles brewing. Peasants in several counties have reportedly refused to work under the conditions mandated by the Statute of Labourers. Some lords have responded with force, imprisoning or evicting those who resist. "Bad business, that," comments a travelling merchant stopping in town. "Evicting your workers when there's half as many as before. Who's going to plant the crops and tend the livestock? The lord and his fine-fingered wife." The mockery contains a serious point. The nobility's attempts to maintain the old order through coercion were often self-defeating. Driving away scarce workers only exacerbated their economic problems. But many lords were slow to grasp this reality. Having held nearly absolute power over their peasants for generations, they couldn't adapt to a world where common labourers had leverage and options. One bright afternoon, as you deliver a completed garment to a manor house outside town, you witness this disconnect firsthand. The lord of the manor, a middle-aged man with an impressive beard and fine velvet clothing, is berating a group of field workers within earshot of anyone nearby. "Insolence," he shouts, face flushed with anger. "My father and his father before him paid 2 pennies daily for field work, and that was considered generous. Now you ungrateful wretches demand 6? The law is clear on this matter. The field workers, sun-browned men and women with calloused hands and weathered faces, stand their ground with surprising confidence. Their spokesperson, an older man with a dignified bearing despite his rough clothing, responds calmly. My lord, with respect, 2 pennies no longer buys what it once did. Prices have risen since the mortality, and there are fewer hands to do the same work. That's not my concern, the lord snaps. The king's law sets the wage, and you will obey or face the consequences. The spokesman exchanges glances with his fellows, then shrugs. As you wish, my lord. We shall depart your lands this evening, then. The lord's face darkens further. You cannot leave, you are bound to this land. Begging your pardon, my lord, but that's not true anymore. The courts have ruled that with enough coin we can buy our freedom of movement, and we have enough coin. There's a note of pride in the man's voice. This was another significant change accelerated by the plague. The system of serfdom, which had bound peasants to the land for generations, was crumbling under economic pressure. Many lords, desperate for immediate cash after losing rental income during the plague, had allowed peasants to buy their way out of traditional obligations. Now they were facing the consequences of those short-sighted decisions. The lord sputters with indignation, but seems to realize he's in a weak position. His lands need tending, and workers are scarce. Fine, he concedes through gritted teeth. 4 pennies daily and not a farthing more, and you'll work from dawn to dusk, not slacking off at midday, as has become your habit. The spokesman confers briefly with the others, then nods. Acceptable, for now. Though when harvest comes, we'll need to revisit the rate. As you slip away, having witnessed this extraordinary negotiation between a lord and his former serfs, you marvel at how thoroughly power dynamics have shifted. Even just 10 years ago, peasants dictating terms to their lord would have been unthinkable. Back in town that evening, you share what you witnessed with Walter and a few others gathered at a local tavern. The modest establishment is itself a testament to improved conditions for working people. Before the plague, few ordinary craftsmen would have had the extra coins to spend on ale at day's end. It's happening everywhere, confirms a carpenter recently arrived from another region. Lords trying to enforce the old ways, workers refusing and either negotiating better terms or simply walking away to find better situations. Can't blame the lords for trying, says an older man nursing his ale in the corner. Their whole world is built on us staying in our place, doing as we're told for whatever scraps they decide to throw us. Then they need to build a new world, Walter replies sharply, because the old one died with half of Europe. This philosophical recognition that the social order itself needed to change, not just specific wage rates or working conditions, was spreading among ordinary people. The plague had created a crack in the seemingly immutable hierarchy of medieval society, and through that crack, new ideas were beginning to flow. Not all political authorities were as rigid as that manor lord, however. Some rulers recognized that adaptation was necessary and sought more sustainable responses to the new reality. The town's mayor, a pragmatic former merchant named Thomas Cook, takes a different approach than many of his peers. At a town council meeting open to guild masters, he addresses the royal wage proclamations directly. "We have received these directives," he acknowledges, holding up the official parchment, "and we are technically required to enforce them. However," he pauses, looking around the room significantly, "our resources for enforcement are limited. We have 3 bailiffs for the entire town. They must prioritize serious crimes, murder, robbery, assault. Should they happen to be too occupied with these grave matters to investigate every report of excess wages," he leaves the implication hanging. This strategic non-enforcement was common in towns where local authorities had more practical concerns than imposing artificially low wages. Many mayors and town councils paid lip service to royal proclamations while quietly allowing market forces to prevail. Furthermore, the mayor continues, the proclamation requires written complaints before an investigation can commence. should no one feel moved to file such complaints. Another meaningful pause. The guildmasters, including Agnes, nod in understanding. There will be an unofficial agreement not to report each other for paying market wages. This kind of collective resistance to unpopular laws required coordination and trust among community members, qualities that had been strengthened in many towns that successfully navigated the plague years. Shared trauma had, in many cases, fostered a sense of solidarity that crossed previous social boundaries. Not all attempts at control focused directly on wages. Rulers also tried other approaches to maintain the old order in the face of demographic collapse. One summer day, a royal tax collector arrives in town, accompanied by an unusually large contingent of guards. He sets up at a table in the town square and begins calling people forward by name. "What's this about?" you ask a townsperson waiting in the growing line. "New tax," comes the grim reply. "They're calling it the labour obligation substitute. If you earned above the legal wage limit this past year, you pay the difference to the crown." This creative approach to wage control through taxation was another strategy employed by desperate authorities. If they couldn't prevent workers from earning higher wages, they would attempt to capture the excess through taxation. When your turn comes, the collector consults his list, notes your occupation and employer, and names a sum that makes your stomach drop. It would wipe out nearly all your carefully accumulated savings. "This is robbery," mutters the person behind you, just loud enough to be heard. The tax collector looks up sharply. "This is the king's law. Pay or face imprisonment." With the guards standing nearby, hands on weapons, there seems little choice. One by one, the townspeople reluctantly hand over their coins, watching months of better living disappear into the collector's strongbox. The anger in the square is palpable but contained. For now. People return to their homes and workshops with empty purses and seething resentment. This was precisely the kind of heavy-handed tactic that would eventually push common people beyond grumbling to outright rebellion. That evening, emergency meetings are held in taverns and guild halls throughout town. At the Clothworkers Guild, Agnes speaks with uncharacteristic passion. "This cannot stand," she declares to the assembled masters and senior journeymen. "They take with one hand what the market gives with another. If we allow this, they'll drain away every benefit we've gained since the mortality." "What can we do?" asks another master. "They have swords, we have scissors and needles." "We have numbers," Agnes counters, "and we have leverage. Without our labour, their fine clothes turn to rags, their food goes uncooked, their homes fall into disrepair. They need us more than we need them, especially now." This growing class consciousness, the recognition that working people held collective power if properly organised, was another profound shift accelerated by the plague's aftermath. The traditional deference to authority was being replaced by a clear-eyed assessment of mutual dependence and bargaining position. The guild votes to join with other craft guilds in a coordinated response. For one day the following week, all non-essential work in town will stop. No cloth will be cut, no bread baked, no metal worked except for emergency repairs. A peaceful but unmistakable demonstration of who really keeps the town functioning. When the appointed day arrives, the market square stands empty of its usual vendors. Shop doors remain closed despite the fine weather. The normal sounds of hammering, sawing and commerce are replaced by an eerie quiet, punctuated only by the essential activities that continue. Caring for animals, tending to the sick, guarding the town walls. The mayor, caught between royal authority and local reality, attempts to mediate. He meets with guild representatives in the town hall, hearing their grievances and proposals. "We understand the crown needs revenue," Agnes acknowledges as spokesperson for the cloth workers. "But not at the expense of working people's ability to feed their families." A flat tax that treats everyone equally would be acceptable. This targeted punishment of successful trades is not. Similar work stoppages are occurring in towns across the region, you later learn, not coordinated in any formal way, but arising from the same conditions and grievances. Common people, empowered by their post-plague leverage, are finding their political voice in ways that would have been unimaginable before. The authorities' response varies by location. In some places, there are arrests and crackdowns. In others, including your town, pragmatism prevails. The mayor negotiates a compromise, a smaller, more evenly distributed tax that wealthy merchants will help offset for the poorest workers. The work stoppage ends after just one day, having made its point without causing serious hardship. But something has fundamentally changed in how ordinary people view their relationship to authority. They pushed too hard, Walter observes as work resumes the next day, made us realize we don't have to just take whatever they impose. This political awakening among common people was perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the post-plague power shift. Having tasted both economic improvement and successful resistance to unjust authority, working people would never again be quite as accepting of their divinely ordained place in the hierarchy. As summer turns to autumn, word reaches town of more serious confrontations elsewhere. In some regions, peasants have reportedly taken up arms against lords attempting to enforce the old labour obligations. There are rumours of manor houses burned, officials driven off, even lords held hostage until better terms are agreed upon. It won't come to that here, will it? Emma asks anxiously when such stories are discussed in the workshop. Not if the authorities are smart, Agnes replies. Violence helps no one. Fair treatment benefits everyone in the end. Her words reflect a moderate position held by many guild masters and town leaders, seeking reform rather than revolution, but firmly committed to defending the gains made since the plague. But not all in power were willing to adapt. Some clung desperately to the old order, unable to imagine a world where common labourers had rights and leverage. Their resistance to change would set the stage for more dramatic confrontations in the years to come. As you walk home through the autumn twilight, golden leaves crunching beneath your feet, you reflect on how completely the world has transformed in the few short years since the plague passed. Not just economically, with better wages and living conditions, but politically and philosophically as well, as the old certainties about one's place in the world have crumbled like the walls of abandoned plague houses. In their place, something new is rising, messier, less defined, but with the potential to be more just than what came before. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. The authorities will try new tactics to reassert control. Workers will find new ways to resist. The dance between old power and new reality will continue, gradually reshaping Europe's social and political landscape in ways that will echo for centuries. But for tonight, you return to your room, no longer just shelter, but a genuine home, and appreciate how far you've come from the frightened plague survivor of a few years ago, with nothing but uncertainty ahead. Whatever the future holds, you face it not as a powerless subject, but as someone with skills, value, and a voice in determining your own fate. That transformation, born from tragedy but nurtured by collective resilience, may be the most important legacy of the world that emerged from the shadow of the Black Death. A year passes. You've settled comfortably into your role as a journeyman seamster, with steady work and fair pay despite the authorities' continued efforts to roll back wages. The confrontation over the special tax has faded into memory, but the underlying tensions between workers and rulers remain, simmering beneath the surface of daily life. Winter has given way to spring, and spring to early summer. The countryside around your town is lush and green, the crops promising a good harvest if the weather holds. But alongside the natural abundance, a different kind of growth is occurring, a slow, steady increase in anger and resentment among the common people. You first notice it in small ways. Conversations in the tavern grow more heated, with bitter complaints about lords who still treat workers as disposable property. Travellers bring stories of harsher enforcement of wage laws in neighbouring regions. There are whispered accounts of bailiffs roughed up while trying to arrest labourers for demanding better pay. Things are getting worse, not better, Walter tells you one evening as you share a loaf of bread in your room. Lords are panicking as they realise the old world isn't coming back. Makes them dangerous. He's right. After nearly 3 decades of watching their power and wealth erode, many among the nobility and ruling classes have moved beyond mere legislation. Some are now resorting to outright oppression to maintain control. "My cousin works on Lord Bedford's estate," Emma confides during a lunch break at the workshop. "Says the Lord hired mercenaries to force workers to accept lower wages. Anyone who complains gets beaten or driven off with nothing." Such stories are becoming common, each one adding fuel to the growing anger among working people. The shared prosperity that followed the plague is being threatened, not by natural disaster or disease, but by deliberate human action. The workshop has fallen silent, everyone listening to Emma's account. "That won't end well," Agnes observes quietly. "Desperate people do desperate things." Her words prove prescient. Within days, news reaches town that workers on several manors in the next county have risen up against their lords. Not just refused to work, but actively rebelled, burning tax records, opening grain stores, even taking up arms against officials sent to enforce wage controls. "They're calling it the True Commons," reports a peddler passing through town. "Common folk taking back what's rightfully theirs, standing together against the Lord's greed." The authorities respond predictably, with force. Royal troops are dispatched to put down what they're calling unlawful assemblies and treasonous riots. There are reports of brutal reprisals, rebel leaders executed, participants whipped or mutilated, entire villages punished collectively. But unlike previous centuries, when such crackdowns might have quickly restored order, something different is happening. The harsh response isn't quelling the unrest, it's spreading it. "It's the new world we live in," explains an elderly monk who stops at the workshop to commission a repair to his robe. Before the Great Death, peasants were isolated. One village knew little about the next. News travelled slowly. Rebellions were easily contained. He pauses, watching Agnes carefully measure and mark the worn fabric. Now, survivors move between towns and manors freely. They talk, compare situations, share grievances. They've tasted better lives and won't easily surrender those gains. This increased mobility and communication, a direct result of post-plague labour shortages, was transforming isolated discontent into something more dangerous to the established order, a movement with shared grievances and aspirations. Summer progresses, bringing both the promise of harvest and increasing reports of unrest from across the region. The atmosphere in town grows tense as conflicting rumours swirl through marketplaces and taverns. "Heard the rebels captured a sheriff in Norwich," claims one traveller. "The king's sent his personal guard to crush them," counters another. "They've got 10,000 men gathering in Essex," says a third. Separating truth from exaggeration is impossible, but the overall picture is clear. Something unprecedented is unfolding across England, a coordinated uprising of working people against what they perceive as unjust authority. One warm evening, as you're finishing work for the day, an unexpected visitor appears at the workshop door, a man in dusty travelling clothes with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to danger. "I bring word from the Commons in Kent and Essex," he announces without preamble. Once Agnes has closed the door behind him, the time has come to stand together. 3 days hence, representatives from towns and villages will gather at Blackheath. We seek support from craftspeople and town workers as well as field labourers. This is no longer rumour but direct recruitment. The visitor, who carefully avoids giving his name, is a messenger for what has become known as the Great Revolt, though history will later call it the Peasants' Revolt. "What exactly are you asking of us?" Agnes inquires, her tone neutral but not hostile. "Join us if you can. If not, provide food, shelter for those passing through, spread our message." The messenger reaches into his bag and produces a crude pamphlet. "Our demands are just. Read for yourselves." The pamphlet, hand-copied on cheap parchment, lists grievances and demands that resonate with many in the room: fair wages, freedom of movement, an end to serfdom, no more punitive taxation of workers. Agnes studies it thoughtfully. "Much of this I agree with, but armed rebellion? That brings its own dangers." "We tried petitions," the messenger responds simply. "We tried legal challenges. We tried working within the system." The lords responded with cudgels and swords. What choice remains? After he departs, a heated discussion erupts among the workshop staff. Walter and 2 others favour actively supporting the rebels. Emma and Marjorie counsel caution. Agnes remains thoughtful, weighing principles against practicalities. "I won't tell any of you what to do," she finally says. "Each must decide according to conscience, but remember, regardless of how just the cause, rebellion is dangerous. The powerful don't surrender power willingly." That night, you lie awake for hours considering your own position. The rebels' demands seem reasonable, even moderate to you. They're not calling for the overthrow of all authority or the death of the king, merely for fair treatment and basic dignity. But Agnes's warning echoes in your mind. History is filled with failed uprisings and terrible reprisals. The decision becomes moot the next morning when royal proclamations are posted throughout town. Any gathering of more than 3 persons outside guild or church functions is forbidden. Travel between towns requires written permission. Supporting or sheltering rebels is punishable by imprisonment. The town falls into an uneasy quiet. Official business continues, but ordinary people speak in whispers, casting nervous glances at the increased presence of bailiffs and royal guards in the streets. For nearly a week, this tense calm holds. Then, like a thunderclap from a clear sky, electrifying news arrives. The rebels have entered London itself. Not just a few infiltrators, but thousands of commoners from Kent and Essex, admitted to the city by sympathetic Londoners. "They're meeting with the king himself," reports a wide-eyed messenger who's ridden the nobility to petition the monarch directly. It represents a fundamental challenge to the entire feudal hierarchy, where communication with the king was supposed to flow through proper channels of lords and officials. "Smart lad," comments Walter when you discuss the news that evening. "Richard knows he's outnumbered. Better to negotiate than face a bloodbath in his own city." Over the following days, fragmented reports trickle in, each more astonishing than the last. The rebel leader, a man named Wat Tyler, presented demands directly to the teenage King Richard II at Mile End. The king apparently agreed to many of them, including the abolition of serfdom and feudal services, fairer rents, and a general pardon for all rebels. Could it really be that easy? Emma wonders aloud, voicing the question on everyone's mind. Centuries of oppression ended by a single royal decree? The more experienced among you share skeptical glances. History has taught working people to distrust easy victories. That skepticism proves warranted when the next news arrives. At a second meeting at Smithfield, Wat Tyler was killed in an altercation with the Lord Mayor of London. Without their leader, the rebel forces fragmented. The young king, showing unexpected cunning, took advantage of the confusion to renege on his promises. The pardons are revoked, announces a grim-faced town crier. All rebel gatherings are to disperse immediately. Leaders will be hunted down and executed as traitors. The brutal suppression that follows confirms the worst fears of those who counselled caution. Royal forces, reinforced by noble households and mercenaries, sweep through areas that supported the rebellion. Hundreds are executed, often without trial. Thousands more face fines, imprisonment, or maiming. They're making examples, Marjorie says quietly, as news of the reprisals spreads, ensuring no one tries this again. A heavy pall falls over the workshop, over the entire town. The brief, bright hope of fundamental change has been extinguished, replaced by the harsh reality of power reasserting itself through violence. Or has it? As weeks pass and the immediate crackdown fades, you begin to notice something curious. Despite the rebellion's apparent failure, subtle changes persist. The harshest enforcement of wage controls seems to have been abandoned. Local officials are more hesitant to antagonize workers. Lords, who had been particularly oppressive, now tread more carefully. They're scared, Walter observes with grim satisfaction. They won the battle but know they might not win the next one. This was the paradox of the Great Revolt of 1381. Though crushed militarily and its explicit demands rejected, it nevertheless changed the relationship between rulers and ruled. The nobility had been forced to recognise, however reluctantly, that pushed too far, common people would resist collectively. That fall, a royal tax assessor visits town. Unlike the previous year's heavy-handed collector, this one is almost deferential, careful to explain the purpose of each levy and to assess amounts that, while not welcome, are at least not ruinous. They've learned something at least, Agnes remarks after he departs, though I wonder how long the lesson will last. Not everyone sees the rebellion and its aftermath the same way, of course. When a cloth merchant from London visits the workshop to place a large order, he expresses the perspective of many among the upper classes. Criminal madness, that's what it was, he declares, watching Agnes measure fine imported fabric for his new clothing. Common rabble thinking they could dictate to their betters. And why? Because they've had a few years of good wages. He shakes his head in disgust. As the chronicler Froissart wisely noted, it was because of the abundance and prosperity in which the common people then lived that this rebellion broke out. Agnes makes no direct response, but you catch the slight tightening of her lips as she continues working. The merchant's attitude, that better living standards for workers were themselves the problem, reveals the gulf in worldview between the classes. Winter arrives, bringing shorter days and longer nights for reflection. In taverns and guild halls, around hearth fires and workshop tables, people discuss what was gained and lost in the tumultuous year. The rebellion failed, says one pessimist. But something has changed, counters another. They know now we won't be pushed past a certain point. Both perspectives hold truth. The immediate goals of the revolt went unfulfilled. Serfdom wasn't abolished by royal decree. The legal machinery of control remained in place. Yet beneath the surface, tectonic shifts were occurring. The relationship between lord and peasant, master and worker, ruler and subject was being renegotiated through countless small interactions, not through grand proclamations or pitched battles, but through the daily exercise of newly discovered leverage and reluctantly acknowledged interdependence. Bit by bit, Walter tells you, one snowy evening, as you both warm yourselves by the workshop's small fire after everyone else has left. That's how real change happens, not all at once, but bit by bit, like water wearing away stone. You nod, considering how much has already changed since the plague years. Do you think there will be more rebellions? Walter stares into the flames for a long moment. Probably. When people taste a better life, they don't easily go back. The lords won't stop trying to reclaim what they've lost, and we won't stop resisting. His assessment proves accurate in the years that follow. Though no uprising matches the scale of the 1381 revolt, smaller rebellions flare periodically across Europe. Each is suppressed, yet each also reinforces the message that common people have both the will and capability to resist oppression. More importantly, the daily, non-violent resistance continues. Workers negotiating better terms, moving away from harsh conditions, finding creative ways around restrictive laws. This quiet persistence proves more transformative in the long run than dramatic but short-lived rebellions. One spring day, nearly 3 years after the Great Revolt, you receive unexpected news. A manor near your hometown is seeking skilled cloth workers, offering unusually favourable terms, good wages, decent housing, limited service to the lord, and crucially, a written contract guaranteeing these conditions. It's becoming more common, explains the messenger who brings the offer. Smart lords have figured out that treating workers well is good business. They get stable labour, higher productivity, fewer disruptions. This pragmatic adaptation represents yet another path of change, not through royal decree or violent uprising, but through the gradual recognition by some among the elite that the old methods no longer work in the post-plague world. Agnes encourages you to consider the opportunity. You've learned all I can teach you, she says. With your skills, you could establish your own workshop there eventually, perhaps even join the guild as a master one day. The prospect is tempting, a return to familiar landscapes, but with status and security your parents could never have imagined. It represents the culmination of the strange, tragic blessing that the plague bestowed on its survivors. As you contemplate this next step in your journey, you reflect on how completely European society has been transformed in the decades since the Black Death. Economic relationships, social hierarchies, political power, and even the basic assumptions about one's place in the world. All have shifted, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. The revolt of 1381 wasn't the cause of these changes, but rather a dramatic symptom of them. The true revolution was the slow, grinding readjustment forced by demographic collapse and its economic consequences. Every negotiation over wages, every worker who walked away from bad conditions, every lord who adapted rather than clung to the past. These were the real engines of transformation. "Will you take the offer?" Walter asks when you tell him about it. "I'm considering it," you reply. "It feels like a chance to be part of building something new." He nods in understanding. "That's what we're all doing, isn't it? Building a new world from the ashes of the old one." His words capture the essential truth of Europe after the Black Death. Amid the grief and trauma, amid the power struggles and rebellions, amid the daily challenges of survival, something new was emerging. A society where ordinary people had more agency, more dignity, and more possibility than before. The transition wasn't clean or easy. The old order fought desperately to maintain its privileges. Progress came in fits and starts, with setbacks and reversals along the way, but the direction was clear, toward greater freedom and opportunity for those who had previously been bound to lives of subsistence and subservience. As you drift towards sleep that night, considering the path ahead, you realize that your individual story mirrors the larger one unfolding across the continent. From the horror of plague has come unexpected opportunity. From the collapse of old certainties has come the chance to build something better. Whatever you decide about the manor offer, whatever challenges lie ahead, you face the future not as a powerless subject of forces beyond your control, but as someone with choices and agency, a participant in the great remaking of the world that began when death visited Europe and, in its terrible passage, sowed the seeds of rebirth. You decide to accept the offer from the manor near your hometown, drawn by both opportunity and nostalgia. After fond farewells to Agnes, Walter, and your other friends at the workshop, you make the journey back to familiar landscapes transformed by time and plague. The manor proves everything the messenger promised: fair conditions, good pay, and a lord who seems to understand that treating workers well serves his interests better than clinging to outdated notions of servitude. You establish yourself quickly, your skills earning respect and steady work. But something else awaits you in this region, something strange and unsettling that reveals how deeply the plague years scarred the collective psyche of those who survived. Your first hint comes on a mild spring day in 1374, over 2 decades since the initial Black Death swept through Europe. You're visiting the nearby town market when an agitated traveller bursts into the square, his clothes dusty from the road. "They're dancing," he announces to anyone who will listen. "In Aachen and Cologne, hundreds of them dancing without stop, without music, until they drop from exhaustion." People gather around, faces skeptical but curious. Tales of wonders and horrors, a common currency among travellers, often exaggerated or entirely invented. "Dancing?" someone scoffs. "What nonsense is this?" The traveller's eyes are wide, haunted. "No nonsense. I saw them myself. Men, women, even children, seized by some madness that forces them to dance. They cry out in pain but cannot stop. Their feet bleed through their shoes, yet still they dance." A chill runs through you despite the warm day. There's something in his voice, a raw authenticity that suggests he's describing something truly witnessed, not merely invented. In the weeks that follow, more reports arrive, each confirming and expanding the original account. A strange affliction is spreading through towns along the Rhine River, a compulsion to dance that seizes people without warning and doesn't release them until they collapse from exhaustion. "They call it St. John's Dance," explains Father Thomas, the local priest, when concerned parishioners question him after Mass. "Some believe it a curse, others a blessing. The victims either possessed by demons or touched by divine ecstasy." His own opinion, carefully measured, leans toward the former. "Whatever its nature, I urge caution. Stay away from affected areas. Pray for those afflicted." But the dancing sickness spreads regardless of prayers or precautions. By midsummer, cases are reported in Liège, just 2 days' journey away. Then, on St. John's Day itself, it arrives in your town. You're working in your small shop when a commotion draws you to the window. In the street outside, a woman is spinning in circles, arms outstretched, face contorted in what might be agony or ecstasy. A small crowd has gathered around her, keeping their distance. As you watch, a young man steps forward, perhaps to help her. He reaches out, and then suddenly, he too begins to dance, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. "Stay back," shouts someone in the crowd. It's catching. Over the next few hours, more succumb. By evening, nearly 20 people are caught in the strange dance, twirling, leaping, stomping in a macabre spectacle that seems to have no end. Their faces show exhaustion, even pain, but their bodies won't obey commands to stop. You keep your distance, watching from the safety of doorways and windows as the afflicted dance through the night. By morning, some have collapsed where they stood, bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion. Others continue, feet bloody in torn shoes, muscles spasming, eyes glazed. "What causes this madness?" you ask Martin, the town physician, who looks on with professional curiosity tempered by caution. He shakes his head slowly. "Some of my colleagues blame heavenly alignments or poisonous vapours. Others speak of tainted rye bread harbouring a fungus that affects the mind. And you?" Martin hesitates, choosing his words carefully. "I wonder if it might be a sickness of the soul rather than the body. These past decades have brought horrors beyond comprehension. The mind, like a bent branch, can only bear so much weight before it breaks." His perspective is insightful. Everyone in Europe had been touched by the plague, if not directly through illness, then through loss, grief, and the constant fear of death's return. Entire families disappeared overnight. Children were orphaned, communities decimated. The survivors carried invisible wounds deeper than any physical affliction. "Look at them," Martin continues softly. "Notice how many are those who lived through the worst of the great mortality as children or young adults. They've held their terrors inside for years, perhaps. Now something has broken loose." You observe the dancers more carefully and realize he's right. Few among them are very young or very old. Most are people who would have been children or adolescents when death swept through Europe. The dancing continues for days. Local authorities, unsure how to respond, initially try restraining some of the afflicted. This proves disastrous. Those tied down injure themselves, struggling against their bonds, screaming that they must dance or die. A more effective approach emerges from an unexpected source. Musicians, first a lone piper, then others joining, begin playing for the dancers, providing rhythm and structure to their previously chaotic movements. "If they must dance," explains the piper, "better they dance to music that may eventually soothe them to stillness." Remarkably, this seems to help. With music guiding them, the dancers' movements become less frantic, more coordinated. Some even appear to find moments of genuine joy amid their compulsion, the tortured expressions occasionally giving way to smiles or peaceful countenance. Most eventually stop, collapsing into deep sleep from which they awaken confused but free of the dancing compulsion. A few, however, seem unable to break the spell. They dance until their hearts give out, dying on their feet in a final terrible pirouette. As the immediate outbreak subsides, leaving the town shaken but recovering, you have a conversation with an elderly weaver who witnessed a similar phenomenon decades earlier. "After the famine of 1315, something like this happened," she tells you, her gnarled hands continuing their work even as she speaks. Not as widespread, but the same madness of movement always seems to follow great suffering. The old woman's observation aligns with what you've seen and heard. The dancing plague appears to erupt in communities that have endured extraordinary collective trauma. The most recent outbreak following not just the original Black Death, but several subsequent waves of plague that revisited Europe throughout the 1360s and early 1370s. Heard rumours of a third outbreak in Venice just this spring, the weaver adds. Perhaps that was the spark that lit this fire of madness. Indeed, fear of plague's return haunted the European consciousness. Each rumour, each reported case in distant cities sent ripples of terror through communities that had already suffered beyond measure. The dancing plague of 1374 eventually runs its course, fading by autumn as mysteriously as it appeared, but it leaves behind questions that linger in conversations around hearth fires and tavern tables. What invisible forces can seize control of human bodies so completely? Where is the line between physical ailment and affliction of the mind? How much suffering can a person or a society endure before something breaks? You find yourself particularly troubled by memories of the dancers' faces, the looks of bewildered anguish as their bodies betrayed them, forcing movement when they desperately desired rest. In those expressions, you recognized something familiar, the same helpless terror you'd seen during the plague years, when people watched death claim their loved ones despite every prayer and remedy. Over the following years, other strange maladies emerge across Europe. In some regions, people are seized by fits of uncontrollable laughter that last for days. In others, outbreaks of mysterious visions occur, with dozens or hundreds claiming to see angels or demons in the sky. The world broke something in us, Walter writes in a letter from your old town. The plague wasn't just a disease of the body, it infected our minds, our souls. We're still sick in ways we don't understand. His words ring true. The dancing plague, the laughing fits, the mass visions, all seem to be expressions of a collective trauma too profound for normal grieving. When death claims a third of everyone you've ever known, when the very foundations of society crack beneath your feet, when God himself seems to have abandoned his creation, how does the human spirit process such enormity? In some cases, the answer appears to be these eruptions of shared madness, where inner terrors take physical form. The most disturbing aspect, perhaps, is how contagious these conditions prove to be. Like the plague itself, the dancing mania seems to spread through proximity and observation. One person begins, others follow, not through conscious choice, but as if some invisible influence passes between them, bypassing rational thought. The mind is more mysterious than the body, Martin the physician tells you during a chance meeting years after the dancing outbreak, and minds connected by shared suffering may be capable of influencing each other in ways we don't yet comprehend. His theory gains credence in your eyes when, in the summer of 1381, the same year as the peasants' revolt, another wave of dancing mania sweeps through the Rhineland. This time, you observe it from a safer distance, having relocated again to a town farther from the affected areas. The pattern is familiar, beginning with one or a few individuals, spreading rapidly, affecting primarily those who lived through the worst plague years. Once again, musicians attempt to help, providing rhythm to contain the chaotic energy. Once again, some dancers find release through exhaustion, while others dance until death claims them. What differs in this outbreak is the response of authorities. Having seen previous episodes, many towns now have protocols in place, designated areas where dancers can be taken, musicians ready to play healing rhythms, physicians and priests working together to offer whatever comfort is possible. This more organized, compassionate response reflects a broader evolution in how European society addresses suffering. The unimaginable losses of the plague years have, paradoxically, nurtured greater empathy among survivors. Communities that endured together have learned to heal together, developing collective responses to collective trauma. Not all responses are so enlightened, of course. In some regions, dancers are still viewed as possessed by demons or punished by God for sin. They face exorcism, imprisonment, or worse. But increasingly, a more nuanced understanding prevails, recognition that afflictions of the mind deserve compassion rather than condemnation. This shift represents one of the subtler but more profound changes wrought by the Black Death and its aftermath. Prior to the plague, illness, whether physical or mental, was often seen purely through the lens of divine punishment or demonic influence. Afterward, more people began to consider natural causes and human remedies alongside spiritual explanations. Perhaps God works through our understanding as well as our faith, suggests Father Thomas, who has remained surprisingly open-minded despite his clerical training. If we can ease suffering through music or medicine or simple kindness, is that not also doing his work? This perspective, that human action and divine purpose might work in harmony rather than opposition, represents a significant theological evolution, one that would eventually help pave the way for both scientific advancement and religious reformation. The dancing plagues and similar phenomena continue to appear sporadically across Europe for centuries, though never again on the scale of the 1374 outbreak. Each instance seems to follow periods of extreme collective hardship, war, famine, disease, as if the accumulated stress of survival eventually demands release through these extraordinary manifestations. In your own region, the memory of the dancers gradually fades into legend. Children who never witnessed the events hear stories that grow more fantastical with each telling. The real suffering of the afflicted becomes obscured by embellishment and supernatural explanations. But for those who saw it firsthand, the dancing plague remains a visceral reminder of how deeply the Black Death and its aftermath penetrated the European psyche. The disease killed bodies, but the trauma transformed minds in ways that would reverberate through generations. One cold winter evening, decades after you first witnessed the dancers, you find yourself telling the story to your apprentices gathered around the fire in your now-established workshop. Their young faces, born long after the worst plague years, reflect fascination tinged with skepticism. "Did they really dance until they died?" asks one, eyes wide. "Some did," you confirm. Their hearts simply gave out, but their feet kept moving even as they fell. "But why?" presses another. "What made them do it?" You consider how to explain something that defies simple explanation, even with years of reflection. "Imagine," you say slowly, "that you've watched half the people you've ever known die horribly, that you've lived with fear as your constant companion, wondering each day if death will claim you next, that the world you understood suddenly makes no sense at all." The apprentices are silent, trying to grasp horrors beyond their experience. "The mind can only bear so much," you continue. "Sometimes what cannot be expressed in words must emerge through the body instead, like a fever of the soul," murmurs the oldest apprentice, unexpectedly poetic. "Yes," you nod, "exactly like that, a fever that broke not in sweat but in movement." As the conversation shifts to other topics, you gaze into the flickering fire, remembering the faces of the dancers, their expressions of mingled agony and release. In them, you had recognized something universal, the human struggle to make meaning from suffering, to find some form of expression when pain exceeds language. The dancing plague, you've come to believe, was neither divine punishment nor demonic possession, but something more profoundly human, collective trauma finding physical form, the unspeakable made visible through bodies in motion. This understanding that afflictions of the mind deserve compassion rather than fear or condemnation represents one of the quieter but more significant legacies of Europe's darkest century. From unimaginable suffering emerged a more nuanced appreciation of human psychology and the complex relationship between mind, body, and community. As you bank the fire for the night, sending your apprentices to their beds, you reflect on how the fabric of European society was rewoven after the plague, not just economically and politically, but psychologically and spiritually as well. The dancing manias, strange as they were, formed part of that reweaving, attempts to mend tears in the collective consciousness through shared, if involuntary, ritual. Outside, snow begins to fall gently, covering the sleeping town in a blanket of white. The world has changed immeasurably since those first terrible plague years, yet human nature remains essentially the same, resilient and fragile, capable of both extraordinary adaptation and unexpected collapse. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small joys and sorrows, but tonight, as you prepare for sleep in the quiet comfort of the life you've built from the ashes of catastrophe, you find yourself grateful for the hard-won wisdom that emerged from Europe's darkest hours. The recognition that healing requires not just physical recovery, but addressing the deeper wounds that linger in the human spirit. The years flow by like a gentle river, carrying you further from the plague years and the dancing manias that followed. Your hair has silvered, your hands show the marks of decades of craftsmanship, but your mind remains sharp and curious. You've prospered in ways your parents could never have imagined, establishing your own successful workshop, training dozens of apprentices, even joining the guild leadership in your town. The economic opportunities created by the plague's aftermath allowed you, a common-born person, beyond your original station. Now, in your later years, you find yourself drawn to Italy. Tales have reached you of something remarkable happening there, a flowering of art, literature, and learning unlike anything seen since ancient times. They're calling it a rinascita, a rebirth or renaissance. You should go, urges your oldest apprentice, now a master craftsman himself and capable of managing the workshop in your absence. See these wonders while you still can. Bring back inspiration for us all. And so, in the autumn of your life, you undertake a journey that would have been unthinkable for someone of your background before the plague changed everything. With comfortable savings and good health, you travel south across the Alps into the vibrant cities of northern Italy. Florence greets you with a splendor that takes your breath away. The city gleams with new buildings of stunning beauty. The massive dome of the cathedral, impossibly large yet perfectly proportioned, dominates the skyline. Palaces and churches showcase architecture that somehow feels both ancient and utterly new. How did this happen? You ask your guide, a local cloth merchant who provides lodging to northern visitors. So much beauty, so quickly. He gestures broadly at the cityscape before you. From death came life, he says simply. The plague broke us, then it forced us to rebuild. This paradox, creation emerging from destruction, becomes clearer as you explore further. Florence and other Italian cities were among the hardest hit by the Black Death. Some lost up to 80% of their population in the initial outbreak. Yet from this catastrophic loss came the seeds of extraordinary renewal. The old ways seem to have failed us, explains a local scholar who welcomes foreign visitors interested in the new learning. When so many died despite every prayer and ritual, people began questioning received wisdom. He leads you through a private library filled with manuscripts. Not just religious texts, but works of ancient Roman and Greek writers, many recently rediscovered and translated. We turned to the ancients for new answers, he explains, carefully unrolling a parchment containing Cicero's writings, or perhaps old answers that had been forgotten. This return to classical sources, what they're calling humanism, lies at the heart of the Renaissance. Rather than rejecting the past entirely, these Italian thinkers are selectively reclaiming it, finding in ancient wisdom new paths forward for a society still recovering from profound trauma. During your stay in Florence, you're fortunate enough to meet one of the leading figures of this movement, an elderly scholar named Coluccio Salutati, who studied under followers of the great Petrarch. Petrarch saw it clearly even while the plague still raged, Salutati tells you. His voice fragile, but his eyes bright with intelligence. He wrote that our age was the worst in human history, that he would have preferred to be born in any other time. You nod, understanding this sentiment deeply. How often had you and others who lived through the great mortality expressed similar thoughts? But instead of merely lamenting, Petrarch did something remarkable. Salutati continues. He began searching ancient texts for wisdom that might help heal a broken world. He believed humans could improve their condition through learning and virtue rather than simply accepting suffering as divine punishment. This perspective, that humans might actively shape their destiny rather than passively accept it, represents a profound shift from medieval thinking. You recognize how it echoes changes you've witnessed in other realms, economic, political, medical, all areas where people increasingly took agency rather than surrendering to traditional authorities. The plague taught us a terrible lesson, Salutati says, gazing out his window at the city below, that the old answers were insufficient, that we needed to think anew. The next day, your guide takes you to see artists at work, sculptors carving marble with a lifelike quality that seems miraculous, painters creating images so realistic they almost breathe. These artisans speak of studying anatomy, of observing nature directly rather than copying older artistic conventions. Before, we painted what we were taught to paint, explains one artist, showing you sketches of the human form that reflect detailed observation. Now we paint what we see with our own eyes. This empirical approach, trusting direct observation over received authority, reflects another significant shift in thinking accelerated by the plague years. When traditional medical treatments failed catastrophically against the Black Death, some physicians began questioning ancient texts and, instead, recording their own observations of disease. Now, artists and scholars in many fields are applying similar principles. You spend weeks in Florence, absorbing its wonders before travelling on to Siena, Bologna, and eventually Venice. Everywhere you find similar patterns, cities devastated by plague that have emerged transformed, their wealthy merchant classes funding spectacular new buildings, and art. Their scholars pursuing new knowledge through a blend of ancient wisdom and fresh observation. In Venice, you meet a bookseller who deals in the revolutionary new technology of printing with movable type, which is spreading rapidly across Europe. Before the plague, all books were hand-copied, available only to the wealthy few, he explains, showing you a printed volume whose cost, while still substantial, is a fraction of what a hand-copied manuscript would require. Now knowledge can spread more widely. This democratization of learning parallels what you've witnessed in other areas, the increased power of common workers, the decline of rigid hierarchies, the greater social mobility, all seem connected to the great levelling brought about when death claimed nobles and peasants alike without distinction. The world was remade, the bookseller observes, not all at once, but gradually, as people realised the old barriers needn't stand. As your journey through Italy continues, you notice something else, a change in how human beings themselves are portrayed and understood in this Renaissance culture. Medieval art had emphasized the spiritual over the physical, often depicting humans as merely vessels for divine purpose. The new art celebrates the human form and human accomplishments in their own right. "For mankind is the measure of all things," quotes an enthusiastic young scholar in Padua, referencing the ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras. This is what we're rediscovering, that humans have dignity and worth beyond merely being sinners awaiting salvation. This renewed emphasis on human potential strikes you as yet another response to the plague years. When faced with mortality on such an overwhelming scale, survivors sought meaning not just through religious devotion, but through celebrating what makes life itself valuable: beauty, knowledge, achievement. In Florence again, near the end of your Italian sojourn, you visit a workshop where a young artist named Botticelli is creating works of extraordinary beauty that blend Christian themes with classical imagery. His paintings showcase not just technical skill, but a vision of humanity that seems to transcend the suffering of recent centuries. "How do you create such beauty after such darkness?" you ask him. Botticelli considers this thoughtfully while mixing pigments. "Perhaps beauty is our answer to darkness," he suggests, "our defiance of death." His words stay with you as you begin your journey homeward, carrying sketches, small art pieces, and most importantly, new perspectives to share with your community. Crossing the Alps again, now heavy with early winter snow, you have ample time to reflect on how completely Europe has transformed in the decades since the Black Death first arrived. The economic changes came first: higher wages, greater mobility, weakened feudalism. Then political shifts as workers demanded better treatment and revolted when refused. The psychological aftermath expressed itself through dancing plagues and other strange manifestations of collective trauma. And now, this cultural flowering, a renaissance of learning, art, and human-centered thinking emerging from societies that had stared into the abyss of near extinction. None of it erases the immeasurable suffering of the plague years. Nothing could compensate for so many millions of deaths. But human resilience found ways to create meaning and beauty even from history's greatest catastrophe. Back home, you share what you've witnessed with eager audiences. Your stories of Italian wonders inspire local artisans to experiment with new techniques. Your descriptions of classical learning prompt some to seek out books and education previously thought unnecessary for common folk. "It's spreading," comments your former apprentice, now more friend than subordinate. This renaissance, not just in Italy anymore. He's right. While Italy remains the epicenter, the new approaches to art, learning, and human potential are beginning to appear across Europe. The economic prosperity of post-plague society creates markets for art and books. The weakening of old hierarchies allows talent to emerge from previously suppressed classes. The psychological need to make meaning from suffering drives creative expression. As you settle into the winter of your life, you find yourself reflecting often on the strange journey you've witnessed, not just your own personal rise from humble origins to respected guildsmen, but Europe's collective journey from devastation to renewal. One snowy evening, sitting by the fire with a few close friends and family, someone asks what you consider the most important change to emerge from the plague years. You consider this carefully, watching firelight play across familiar faces. Before the great mortality, you say finally, most people believed the world was fixed and unchangeable. Peasants would always be peasants. Lords would always be lords. Hunger and hardship were simply God's will. Knowledge was what ancient authorities had determined centuries ago. You pause, collecting thoughts refined over decades of observation. After the plague, nothing seemed certain anymore. If half of humanity could vanish in a few years, what else might change? People began questioning everything: social hierarchies, religious teachings, ancient wisdom, humanity's place in the cosmos. And that questioning, adds your former apprentice, led to new answers. Or at least new questions, you smile, which might be even more valuable. This legacy of questioning, of not accepting the world as it is, but imagining how it might be, perhaps represents the plague's most profound impact on European consciousness, from the practical demands of peasants for better wages to the philosophical explorations of Renaissance humanists. A new willingness to challenge received wisdom emerged from the ashes of the old order. Not that change came easily or without resistance. Throughout your life, you've witnessed the powerful fight to maintain traditional privileges. You've seen reactionary movements emerge in both secular and religious spheres. Progress has never been linear or universal. Yet the direction seems clear enough when viewed across the decades. Europe after the Black Death became more fluid, more innovative, more willing to experiment with new approaches in everything from agriculture to art to governance. We're still finding our way, you tell the young ones gathered around your fire, still trying to build something meaningful from what the plague left behind. In your dreams that night, you see again the landscapes of your youth, fields and villages as they were before the great mortality. You see faces long vanished, hear voices long silenced. The losses remain incalculable, the suffering beyond words. Yet, as the dream shifts, you also see what grew from those ashes. Workshops where once serfs create beautiful objects as respected artisans, schools where common children learn to read, paintings that celebrate the dignity of ordinary human life, communities rebuilt with greater justice than before. Not utopia by any measure, not compensation for so much death, but something valuable nonetheless, new possibilities emerging from history's darkest moment. As you age further, your direct memories of the plague years grow distant, softened by time's passage, but their lessons remain embedded in how you understand the world and humanity's place within it. When a bright young woman from your town prepares to journey to Florence to study art, something unimaginable for someone of her background before the plague, you give her your sketches and notes from your own Italian journey. The Renaissance continues through people like you tell her, those willing to question, to create, to imagine better possibilities. She represents a generation born long after the worst horrors, yet still shaped by their aftermath, beneficiaries of the economic, social, and intellectual openings created when the old world collapsed. In your final years, you find comfort in this continuity, the knowledge that even history's greatest catastrophe contained seeds of renewal that continue to flower long after its immediate devastation passed. One peaceful spring evening, as twilight softens the edges of your familiar room, you sit by an open window, enjoying the scent of blossoms and the distant sounds of town life continuing its rhythms. On your lap rests a newly printed book, a collection of humanist writings that would have been unavailable to someone of your station in the world before the plague. As darkness gently falls, you reflect one last time on the long journey you and Europe have taken since those terrible years when death seemed poised to claim everything. The world that emerged with all its flaws and imperfections nevertheless contains more possibility, more beauty, more humanity than what came before. You close your eyes, feeling the weight of years and experiences, the losses and gains, the sorrows and joys that have shaped a lifetime spanning history's hinge. And like Europe itself, you find that after darkness, after suffering, after confronting mortality in its most terrifying form, what remains is neither despair nor blind optimism, but something more valuable, a quiet resilience, a capacity for renewal, and a deepened appreciation for the fragile gift of human existence in all its complexity. The Renaissance that blossomed in the plague's aftermath continues to unfold, not just in grand cathedrals and famous paintings, but in countless small awakenings to new possibilities, in workshops and universities, in governance and commerce, in how people understand themselves and their place in the cosmos. From history's greatest tragedy emerged not redemption, for nothing could redeem so much suffering, but transformation, a world forever changed, carrying both scars and wisdom forward into whatever lies ahead. As sleep approaches, gentle and welcome, you feel at peace with this complex legacy. The world you leave behind differs greatly from the one you entered, reshaped by forces both terrible and profound, yet still fundamentally human in all its striving, failing, and occasional transcendence. And in this knowledge, in this acceptance of life's capacity for both devastation and renewal, you find a final quiet comfort as consciousness fades into dreams, dreams of a future continuing to unfold from seeds planted in humanity's darkest hour. Your breathing slows, your thoughts grow quiet,